Welcome to Summer of SABR, the Golden Celebration Series. My name is Jacob Pomrenke. I'm the Director of Editorial Content at the SABR office in Phoenix. This is number 9 of 9 for the Summer of SABR sessions online here. Thank you all for joining us all summer long as we celebrate our golden anniversary in 2021. Today, we're going to take it back to 1921, a very important year in baseball history. SABR's Century Committee will be presenting some of its research on baseball from 100 years ago and commemorating the anniversaries of some very significant milestones, including the shift from the dead ball era to the lively ball era, the Black Sox trial, baseball's trial of the century, and a simulated World Series between the New York Giants of the National League and the Chicago American Giants of the Negro National League. Now I'm going to turn it over to Sharon Hamilton, chair of SABR's Century Committee and the project manager of our newly published 1921 Century Project. Sharon, take it away.
Hi, thank you for the introduction. So I'm going to now introduce our panelists for the first panel of the 3 sessions this afternoon, this one on the lively ball. So first we have John Fredland. John Fredland is a committee chair for the Society of American Baseball Research's Games Project Research Committee. An attorney and retired Air Force officer, he has served as committee chair since October 2020. He authored the SABR at 50 a 50 Greatest Games feature to help celebrate SABR's golden anniversary in 2021. So welcome, John. Then we'll have Donna Halper. Donna L. Halper is an associate professor of communication and media studies at Lesley University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She joined SABR in 2011, and her research focuses on women and minorities in baseball, the Negro Leagues, and firsts in baseball history. A former radio DJ credited with having discovered the rock band Rush, Dr. Halper reinvented herself and got her PhD at age 64. In addition to her research into baseball, she is also a media historian with expertise in the history of broadcasting. She has contributed to SABR's Games Project and Bio Project, as well as writing several articles for the Baseball Research Journal. Welcome, Donna. And finally, our third speaker today is Steve Steinberg. Steve Steinberg is a historian of the early 20th century. He has co-authored 3 books with Lyle Spatz, including the Seymour Medal winner 1921, the Yankees, the Giants, and the Battle for Baseball Supremacy in New York, and the SABR Baseball Research Award winner, The Colonel and the Hug. He has also written Urban Shocker, Silent Hero of Baseball's Golden Age, also a SABR Baseball Research Award winner. He is the editor of the World Series in the Dead Ball Era. He has also published more than 20 articles, many in SABR publications, including The Spitball and the End of the Dead Ball Era, which appeared in SABR's National Pastime in 2003. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you.
So these are our panelists for today. So I'm going to start first with a question for John. John, you wrote a SABR Games Project piece about a very important anniversary in baseball history, August 5th, 1921, and the first broadcast of a baseball game on commercial radio. Could you tell us something about how that broadcast happened and something about the game?
Awesome. Thank you, Sharon. So I grew up in the Pittsburgh area, and there are just some things that you don't know how you learn them, but you just know that, you know, at Pitt, Jonas Salk developed the polio vaccine, that Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was essentially a local television show with a lot of local people in it, and that on August 5th, 1921, 100 years ago this month, the radio station KDKA broadcast the first ever Major League Baseball game between the Pirates and the Philadelphia Phillies. That was something that KDKA, which still in some form broadcasts Pirate games, would emphasize every year on or about that date. And that was also something that there was always a little item in the newspapers that, hey, we were first. Now that said, doing some more research on it, the story is a little more challenging and a little more complex. So like I always had these images, you know, when Lanny Fratteri, who broadcast the Pirate games when I was young, would talk about, oh, you know, Harold Arlen of KDKA broadcast the first game on August 5th, 1921. You know, I had my images of Bob Prince, and then before that, Rosie Rosewell, and, you know, open the window, Aunt Minnie, here it comes, and things like that. And I imagine like an old guy in a sports jacket and corny phrases and things like that. That was kind of like my view of old time broadcasting. But then digging into this game, especially for writing this project, the story was a little bit different. So Harold Arlen was, not an ex-player, not a sports writer, not somebody who came over from vaudeville or anything like that. Basically, he was a young electrical engineer. He was in his early 20s working for the Westinghouse Corporation in Pittsburgh. He learned that they were having that they had a radio broadcast unit. So he went over to check them out of curiosity, and they said, "Hey, you have a good voice. What maybe you'd like to broadcast for us." And so that's how, a little bit less than a year after KDKA had been involved in broadcasting the results of the 1920 presidential election, that Harold Arlen was over at Forbes Field for this game between the Pirates and the Phillies, broadcasting for KDKA. But there isn't a whole lot, though. You find also when you dig into what happened in these early broadcasts. First of all, you find, and maybe like Donna's article talked about this, and Donna was a great resource on this, that there were actually a lot of other broadcasts of results going on, or broadcasts from commercial places. But the one thing that you could pin down with KDKA on August 5th of 1921 was it was the first play-by-play from a commercial station. But then the record gets murky, because when they talk about the mechanics of it and how it actually came into being, you find a little bit of the broadcast of the presidential election results, a little bit of the broadcast of this game, and a little bit of when KDKA broadcast the a Pitt football game, Pitt and West Virginia, from Forbes Field a couple of months later. So it's kind of a murky record. My sense is that it was a pretty low-key sort of thing, given his background, that it wasn't like how broadcasting became entertainment later on with home run calls. Cy Williams of the Philadelphia Phillies hit a home run in this game, but I'm pretty sure that there wasn't like a cannonball coming, or a you could kiss it goodbye, or even a go ball get out of here, or anything like that. There were it was part of the pennant race. The Pirates and Giants had a very good 1-2 pennant race throughout almost the whole season, much in the same way that the Indians and Yankees did in the American League. And the Giants had caught up the week before, but the Pirates swept the Phillies, who were in pretty bad shape at that time, and moved ahead. And this was the third game of that sweep. But the thing that I'll add, kind of the interesting note, is there's almost no coverage at the time of this. I looked through the Pittsburgh newspapers. I see a lot of mentions of KDKA was going to have maybe tennis results or something like that. Or later in the season, if you tuned in at a certain time, they would give baseball scores. But there was nothing about this game being broadcast leading into it or after it. And it's not like the newspapers didn't cover things off the field, because the coverage of the game notes that John Hedler, National League president, who had spent the previous week in Chicago for the Black Sox trial, tying in many threads from the Century Committee, that he was at the game. But it's kind of a mysterious story that why we didn't have broadcasts after it. Why the Cubs and Boston wound up being more the trendsetters after it. But we had the first broadcast in Pittsburgh on that date, and everything has flowed from there.
Great, thank you for that answer. And I especially like how, of course, in retrospect, we think, well, of course, it must have been a big deal, the first game broadcast on commercial radio. But as you've said, your research shows you it is a big deal, but we recognize that now. They didn't necessarily recognize that at the time. And that's a good segue into my first question for Donna, because she also has delved into the murkiness of baseball on radio, and exactly as you said, John, that it's not a straightforward trajectory. So my question for Donna is, Donna, for the SABR Century 1921 project, you wrote about how even earlier baseball games were broadcast. Could you tell us something about how people heard baseball on radio before that August 5th broadcast?
Absolutely. So first of all, a couple of things in support of what John said, because we did some of this research together. A lot of the early broadcasts were totally at the last minute. They were like, radio is live back then. Okay, there's no audio tape. It won't be invented for years. And you've got the frequency for a couple of hours. And if you don't use it, some other station comes along and they will. So you're basically looking around trying to find something you can, oh wait, there's a game down at the field. Okay, let's go there. And it pretty much, that's exactly how, it wasn't like 6 people on a committee planning it out like we did with this conference. So I'm not horribly shocked when I find that in 1925, they enlist Joe E. Brown, the comedian who's a vaudevillian, and he happened to be in Boston. Hey, Joe, we're doing this Red Sox game. Oh, no, wait, it's the Braves. Okay, we can't get the Red Sox. We'll do the Braves. Want to broadcast it? And Joey Brown's never done a game in his life, but they stick a microphone in front of him, and that is how it happened. Lucky for everyone, it came out just fine. And I'm sure with Harold Arlen, and by the way, the only real record of that lives on in Harold Arlen's memory. We got nothing. There's very little in the newspapers because newspapers back then regarded radio as competition. So for the most part, whatever radio did, it's like, yeah, they mentioned it, but Now back to your question. How did people hear radio back then? Well, first of all, before there was radio, there was newspaper row. Living in the days when there were tons of newspapers. I mean, we today in our internet era, it's like, oh yeah, I want to read the Boston Globe. It's online. I want to read the Pittsburgh Post because it's online. Back then, what's an online? Nobody knows from this. So if you wanted to know what was happening, you would walk down to where the newspapers actually published. And the telegraphers up on the roof, they would get the signals, Morse code, they'd run down. The sports writers would come outside with a chalkboard and they'd write the scores. In some cases, they had like a little play-by-play thingy where they would literally act it out. The newsboys or the newsgirls in a couple of cases would act out, you know, third base, home run, you know. But yes, the catchphrases, nah, people were just happy to find out if their team were winning. Well, Donna, what if you couldn't get down to newspaper row? Well, if you had a friend who was a ham radio operator, he or she might get the scores, same deal, from the telegraph operators at the ballpark and get the scores by Morse code and then just send it out to friends of yours. It was very word of mouth. But I got to talk one real quick about that whole newspaper row experience. Going down in Boston, there was this one street called Washington Street, still there, and 9, count them, 9 newspapers were publishing back then, okay? And you would have chalkboards at your favorite newspaper, and you would just go there, and it became like this communal event. There were jugglers, there were clowns, there were people that like brought ice cream and candy, and it was like this group affair. You'd boo, you'd cheer whenever there was a score, and there's nothing like it today, I suppose. But for people that had nothing else to compare it to, this is how they heard the game. And when radio finally gets on the air, and there were scores as early as 1920 in Medford Hillside, in Detroit, in Pittsburgh, in a few other cities. But when it finally gets on the air that there are games, people are like, is there this much wonderfulness in the world? Because they don't have to go out on a rainy day and stand on newspaper row when the temperature is, you know, hot and humid. They can just sit in the comfort of their home in their little bunny slippers, and suddenly the game comes to them.
That's fantastic. And we're still living that spoiled moment. The game still
Except
comes
we
to
don't
us.
all have bunny slippers.
We know, but and in a variety of ways. I love the fact that Morse code was part of your answer. It is actually one of my favorite things about baseball history is the role that Morse code played in transmitting early games. So.
I wrote an article which will come out imminently in a different journal because it has to do with ham radio history about all of the ham radio operators. And by the way, nobody called them hams back then. That is not in common use, just like the word radio isn't in common use. If you go looking in newspaper research for radio, good luck with that. Try radio phone or wireless telephone. Those are the common names for radio. But yeah, the amateurs were the ones who, thanks to Morse code, were sending out the scores, and they sent them to the radio phone broadcasting stations. And that's how they got on the air. Every station had someone who knew Morse code. You had to in those days.
That's awesome. I love how you've captured the transition, the moment of transition between the 19th century and the 20th century, because that's what we were getting there is the 19th century technology meeting the radio phone of the of the 20th century. So we already have a good question in the question and answer for the radio people. I will ask you if you have questions, please do put them in the Q&A. We'll ask them at the end of this session. So thank you very much for John and Donna for talking about that important moment where baseball starts to be broadcast on radio. We're going to move to another important aspect of the 1921 season now with my question for Steve, because this was a year that was historic in a number of different ways. Steve, you have written extensively about the reasons for the transition between the dead ball era and the lively ball era in the late teens and early 1920s. Could you tell us why these very significant changes in play happened? As part of your answer, could you also comment on the idea of the rabbit ball? In other words, a lot of books on baseball history say that significant changes to the ball influenced changes in play that led to the lively ball era, and that a new kind of ball was the primary reason for the switch from the dead ball to the lively ball era. Would you agree with that? And if not, what factors may have influenced changes in play more?
Thanks, Sharon. Great questions. The first thing is the lively ball era really came about because the owners, the magnates of organized baseball saw an evolving fan base. And there were a lot of immigrants coming into the country the first 2 decades of the 20th century that were just getting involved with American society. And clearly, the dead ball era style of play was a lot harder for a casual fan, a new immigrant, to understand a walk, a stolen base, a sacrifice, and a fly ball. And watching a home run was something that could be more easily related to. At the same time, the game was growing because Sunday baseball was spreading. And of course, New York being the biggest city had just not too long before had legalized Sunday baseball. People worked 6 days a week, and all of a sudden now they could actually go to a game on their day off. And I think that the owners very quickly saw the attendance rising. And let's not forget that in 1919, what Babe Ruth did with his 29 home runs really stunned the baseball world. And I don't think we really realize, and certainly not now, how special a home run really was. It was stunning, especially a home run over the fence, even though some purists, myself included, would find an inside the park home run a lot more exciting to watch, and still would. So there really was an interest in growing the game and attracting these new fans. There's another very intriguing thing that Lyle and I mentioned in 1921 that I have not pursued, very intriguing. And Irving Sanborn, a very respected sports writer at the time, had an article published in shortly after the Black Sox scandal was exposed, that but it was written before the scandal was exposed. It was either the September or the October Baseball magazine, in which he said that one of the reasons for a lot of the rule changes was the fact that the concern over fixed games, and that the pitcher was getting too much power in the game, and they wanted, the owners wanted to balance it out. And as I said many times, really baseball is all about the confrontation between the pitcher and the hitter. And at different times throughout history, one is given a little bit of a push and a nudge. to balance out with the other one. So I've always been intrigued by that comment by Sanborn. And sure enough, after he wrote the article, before it was published, we had the Black Sox scandal exposed. Your second question is also really interesting because the era starting in 1920 is called the lively ball era. But I would tend to come down on the side of the fact that the ball really was not changed. I suppose we can sort of have a conspiracy angle to it. But one of the most powerful arguments is, Major League Baseball made many changes before the 1920 season, outlawing trick pitches. And they could have easily announced that they're going to make the ball a little bit more lively, and they didn't. And so the lively ball era, may not have been a lively ball. So what made the change? Well, first of all, baseball started introducing more fresh and white baseballs during the game. We know that in the dead ball era, sometimes the 2 or 3 balls were all that was used in an entire game. And let's not forget that in the dead ball era, if a ball was hit into the stands, you had to throw it back. And if you didn't, the police went out there and got it. You're taking that ball would be akin to reaching over into the dugout and grabbing a baseball bat. So the fact that the ball could be clean and bright and really easy to be seen is the first thing. And as an aside, when Mike Sowell wrote his book, The Pitch That Killed, about the Ray Chapman incident, he pointed out the fact that in the middle of the 1920 season, the owners were complaining too many baseballs, too much money being spent on baseballs, and they had the umpires back off. And then when Ray Chapman was killed in the late afternoon shadows of the Polo Ground, at that point, it was a done deal that, hey, baseball, a lot of balls were going to be used in the game. The second thing that really happened was the fact that, Babe Ruth came along, and ball players, including star players, at that point would choke up on the bat. And Babe Ruth started doing these things. And, it's been said that if he wasn't a pitcher, somebody would have made him correct his the way that he held onto the bat, swinging from the end of the bat. And just like when my kids were growing up, we would hear the phrase in basketball, like Michael Jordan, be like Mike. I think that there were ball players that said, hey, let's be like the Babe. He's getting all the accolades. He's getting a lot of money. We're going to swing for the fences. And I think with the banning of a lot of the trick pitches, and this is often overlooked, I think the batters starting in 1920, and it didn't happen overnight, and certainly 21 continued the trend of more offense, the batter could get a lot more settled in the box and a lot more comfortable because he knew there wasn't going to be one of these crazy pitches that might not be controlled that would hit him. And finally, the other thing is at the end of the war, Australian wool, which was used as a wartime product, and it became available again, and it allowed for a more tighter wrapping of the ball. So it was not planned that way, but the essence of it was that the ball was wound more tighter and went faster off the bat and further.
Great, thank you for that. I mean, I think what it
Can I
boils
just
down.
add one thing?
Oh, sorry. Yes, of course, Donna.
Oh, no, my bad. Terrible habit. I interrupted. I apologize. But while Steve was talking, I kept thinking about that Negro Leagues game, the no-hitter that Bill Gatewood pitched on January 6th, 1921. And lest those of you that are watching go, how do you know this stuff off the top of your, well, we're all brilliant. That's how, okay? But beyond all being brilliant, we all researched this stuff for the Century Project. We had a lot of fun doing it. And Gatewood, I don't know if it was because the Negro Leagues didn't outlaw trick pitches or if certain pitchers just got away with everything because they were famous and nobody wanted to mess with them. But we know from newspaper accounts that Gatewood had a pocket full of bottle caps and he was like nicking the baseball, and that kind of helped him get his no-hitter. Hello. And the Cuban Giants were furious that he didn't get thrown out of the game, but he didn't. So I'm just kind of curious about that. When you talked about the trick pitches, I wonder if it now this really became like a cat and mouse game now, where it was like, okay, you're not supposed to use the shine ball. Let's see if I can shine it up in another way and get away with it.
Well, that's been going on for as long as baseball's been going along. It ain't cheating if you don't get caught.
That's great. Thank you. And thank you for bringing in the point about we have to consider Negro Leagues play and what was happening in Negro Leagues play at the time as well. The thing I really loved about your answer, Steve, and it's very similar to what John and Donna did with their baseball on radio responses, is saying the historical record is usually more complicated than a straightforward narrative, right? And that's the same with the shift from the dead ball to the lively ball. Ultimately, there were a lot of contributing factors. And you can't just say, oh, there was this one easy story, although a lot of books do say there was one easy story, which was that the ball changed. So thank you very much for telling us the many factors that were involved. So I'll move back to John now. John, as part of the SABR Century 1921 project, the Games Project Committee wrote an astounding over 100 new games entries about Negro National League, American League, and National League play in 1921. As the Games Project Research Committee chair, could you tell us something about some of the personal highlights of seeing your committee work on all these 1921 games this year? And what were some of the aspects of this work that were most meaningful for you?
Awesome. Thank you, Sharon. So you probably, most people in the audience are familiar with the Games Project and our articles, but a short mission statement on them is that we strive for an article on one game between 1,000 and 1,500 words that kind of both puts you into what the game was like in its day, what was at stake. If you went to this game, what would you think of the people and the players? But then on the other hand, also zooming out and saying, what is this game's importance in that season, that era, or baseball in general? And what we aim for is the best account of a game at that size that you can find Googling. I mean, there might be some games. I saw, for example, somebody wrote a book on Game 1 of the 1988 World Series. There might be an occasion to write a book-length version of a game. There might be a game, or there might be a paragraph version of why a game is significant. But our articles strive for the best 1,000 to 1,500 words for free on those. So in this context, like you said, we just recently went over 100 articles. We still have a few more that are making their way out. We've generally tried to publish the articles in chronological order going through the season so that we could kind of track the season in real time. Because a big thing, if you look back, there are seasons that we all experienced in real time, and there's, it might be for, I see Steve Wiener's in the audience, it might be 1951 for him, it might be 1983 for me, and it might be 2006 for someone else. But there's a sense of like the story and the rhythm and the significance of experiencing a season like that, that when you look at a season in the past, unless you go through it chronologically, there's no way that you can get like that kind of perspective on it. I mean, I didn't experience the 1979 season firsthand because I turned 5 that year. But when I was a kid, I would read an account of how that season went for the Pirates. And, now I feel like I lived it, but I don't feel that way about other seasons because I didn't have that resource. So we tried to work through everything chronologically. And we've just recently went over 100 articles. We just also recently went over the most recent article that I submitted to Jacob was by the 51st author to contribute to these articles. And one of the things that really jumps out to me as an organization is like, one of the things that impresses me about SABR is I've been reading about baseball since the 1980s, and I knew about SABR back then and became a member a little bit later, like in 2013. But the people who I know of as like the heavy hitters of SABR, John Thorne, Rob Nyer, people like that, are people whose work I've been following for years and years. And so it's a sign of quality to be part of an organization that people like that contribute to. Now, similarly with the Games Project articles on 1921, I would love to have a John Thorne or a Rob Nyer article. I don't quite have anyone that's quite that famous, maybe outside of SABR circles, but I have an article from Steve Steinberg. I have several articles from Jim Overmeyer, who distinguished Black baseball historian. I have articles from Bill Nowlin, who's a pretty big name in SABR circles. I also have articles from people who, while they haven't written their award-winning books yet, if you follow what SABR puts out, Gary Belleville, Steve Weiner, Gregory Wolf, Kurt Blumenau, who's a big minor league historian. We drew on him for some minor league games. So you have people like that who have really impressive backgrounds, but then you also have people like, not naming any names, but people who have just started writing for SABR this year who have contributed articles, or people who, maybe some of their 1921 articles are the first things they've ever submitted. So I like, for an organization, being part of something that on one hand, you have work from some of the best experts, but on the other hand, where you don't have to be, John Thorne or Bill James or Pete Palmer to get something published. It's nice to be part of something like that. The other thing is, with these articles, you're shedding light on significant aspects of the season. I mean, there might be, like, for somebody with a general knowledge of baseball, 1921, you might know that Babe Ruth broke his year-old home run record. You might know about the first game broadcast. There's a game in June that Babe Ruth pitched in and hit in that people talk about nowadays, with the emergence of a double threat player. But there isn't a whole lot from that year that's been so mined that it couldn't use you couldn't benefit from a fresh article on it. So I like that we have these articles that are out there now that talk about games, talk about stories, talk about perspectives. And there's something more than if you just read Retro Sheet, and there's something more than if you have Retro Sheet open in one window and you have newspapers.com open in the other window. They add something more than that. In addition, though, the area that I am absolutely proudest of is our work on Black baseball and Negro League games. We've written about a lot of individual games, and there have been some other things, like there are articles on exhibitions, one with the Chicago American Giants and the Staleys. So you have like George Hallis playing against, Rube Foster and his team. But the bulk of what we've done are just, these games between the Columbus Buckeyes and the Chicago Giants, or the Chicago American Giants and the St. Louis Giants. And a lot of these relied on sources that aren't the easiest to get. The Chicago Defender, it's out there. They have great play-by-play accounts of a lot of games, but it's a little bit hard to get copies of those. A couple of other papers, the St. Louis Argus and the Chicago Whip, a couple of the other Black newspapers have play-by-play coverage, but they're not necessarily, those games are not on Retro Sheet yet, and they're not, they're a little bit harder to find information on newspapers, which is more focused on like the white newspapers of those times. So what we have are these articles on these games that tell stories, and they also, like, if you look at a lot of writing on Black baseball, and this stuff is great and it's valuable, but it usually focuses on the like best of the best, Josh Gibson playing in a game, or Oscar Charleston, or Satchel Paige. That work is tremendously valuable, as is the work that focuses on all-star games and championships or interracial games. But there isn't a whole lot on what made the Negro National League a league. We focus on, when did Black baseball become Major League? Is that even appropriate to call it that? I mean, that's a huge debate for another day. But one of the key things that separates what was going on in 1920 and 1921 from like 1919 or 1907 is that it was a league. And to have a league, you couldn't just have Oscar Charleston playing for one team one week and another team the next week without any sort of like league sustaining narrative that, he was traded for future considerations or something like that. And you need to have Columbus playing at Detroit and Detroit playing at Columbus. And I think those articles, one of the most valuable things that I think they contribute to baseball research, and one of the things that I'm proudest of, is that they cast the Negro National League as a league. And my hope is that people will read them and find them interesting, but then people will also jump off and say, hey, we can build on these things and create even better research projects and books and documentaries that really celebrate what this game was. So I am proud to, if we've done a part in that, I'm proud to have done so. So that's really what I look at, what it says for SABR as an organization and what we're contributing to the memory of these long forgotten games, especially in Black baseball.
Fantastic. Thank you for that answer. And it really was pretty epic what you guys pulled off this year. I have to say, first of all, on your point about Games Project, I was a pandemic joiner for SABR, and the very first thing I did was a Games Project piece. So it made me feel very welcome, and I absolutely would second what you said, that anyone with any background and any experience in baseball research of any kind, or even no experience in baseball research, but passion to try, is absolutely encouraged to do a Games Project piece. And you're so wonderful to newcomers. I really appreciated my piece, and I can't tell you how thrilling it is to see it online. And I did that, and people can click on it. So anyway, it's a really good feeling. So thank you for all the hard work that you and the rest of the whole Games Project do. It's amazing work. And to the point about the team viewing the season in real time, I have a background in literature research, and so I wrote a blog post for the Ernest Hemingway International Society to let them know that through your project, they could follow the 1921 season the way Ernest Hemingway experienced it, because he was living in Chicago at the time. And how incredible is that, that you could actually put yourself in the shoes of someone 100 years ago and experience the season the way he was watching it. So, and that's still going on.
There's
Donna.
also, while I'm not by any manner of means a heavy hitter like some of the big names, one of the things that mattered to me was we're telling the story. I mean, there's a line in Hamilton, who lives, who dies, who tells your story. Radio, because of the fact that it was all white owners, no offense to white owners, but let's be honest, they did not give the Negro Leagues any respect. Okay, they didn't broadcast any of the games for several decades. I've got a piece going up about that very soon. So in 1921, if you want to know what Bill Gatewood did, if you want to know what the rest of the teams did, there's us. And we're telling the story, and we're keeping those games alive. And I say that's the most important thing that we can do.
That's incredible. What I can't believe we get a line from Hamilton applied to us. So that's how do you top that? That's great. And actually, beautiful segue into my question for you, which is about the Negro League research that you did for the 1921 project. And I agree with John. This was one of my favorite parts of the project too, to see that part of the project really so much hard work done, and that part of baseball history brought to life. So I noticed when I was reading your Games Project piece on the June 6th, 1921, Bill Gatewood of Detroit Stars throws Negro National League's first no-hitter, which was a piece chosen by the Games Project Committee as one of the top 10 games of 1921 for this project, that you listed Ancestry.com as one of your research sources. That really caught my attention, as you do not normally see that particular source cited in the endnotes to Games Project pieces. Could you tell us why you were using Ancestry.com to research this piece, and also something in general about some of the rewards and challenges of doing Negro Leagues research?
So first of all, when you're a researcher, and I do a lot of this stuff for a living, I've been a media historian for more than 3 decades. I've written 6 books, many articles, et cetera, et cetera. But when you're doing this research, you go to every source you can find. And let's be honest, back in the old days, even if you were a white player, baseball didn't pay you a ton of bucks. So you probably had a job in the off season. And if you look on sources like Ancestry.com, you can find the census. And the census will often tell you, what did these people do in the off season? Because not all of them identified as full-time ball players, because in many cases, they weren't. So you look on a census document, you find like, oh, the person was a house painter. That's one more piece of information you didn't have. Or that person was a salesman. And there again, it tells you the name of their wife if they had one. Did they have children? And in many cases, those little pieces of information lead you to something else. You can perhaps find information about the wife. Maybe the wife came from a family where there were other baseball players, et cetera, et cetera. So you just never know where it's going to lead you. I never count out anything. I look for marriage documents. I look, whatever I can find that's going to help me tell the story. Because I'll be honest with you, I'm not a stat head, okay? Not that there's anything wrong with that. There are some people like their entire life is about how many balls and strikes and what about the this and the that, and how about this piece with this metric. That's not me. I'm a storyteller. I want to know, how did the fans feel about this game? How did the players feel about it? Do we have any quotes from anyone? It's a story. And if I'm going to tell it, I need all the information I can find. So I'm going to go look at the white newspapers, because in some cities there was a large Black population, and maybe they wrote about it, because in some cases, yeah, they did. And in some cases there was the Black press. Agreed. A lot of the Black press isn't digitized and is very hard to find. But in other cases, it's on microfilm at libraries. And before the pandemic, I used to just about live at libraries and archives looking it up. I will go anywhere to find information to tell these stories, because if we don't tell them, who will? These stories will die if people don't tell them. So I guess I felt a sense of obligation as a media historian to look in every corner where I might find information. I've found at flea markets, there are like radio magazines that talk about different stuff. I've found letters, I find fan mail. It's amazing the things you can dig up. And yeah, it's like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, and you have to put it together. And it doesn't always go in a straight line, and sometimes it's contradictory. I just did a piece on Sam Lacey. The census says he was born in one city. His autobiography says he was born somewhere else. No, he's not a liar. He just probably has the same problem we all do. Family lore. Like the uncle who was a world traveler. Well, he said he was. And then you go look on the census and the guy never left Brooklyn. Okay, but you didn't know that. You were 5. You just heard that he was a world traveler. So I don't know, maybe somebody told Sam Lacey that he was born in Mystic, Connecticut. What was he going to do? Get out of the cradle and question it? I'll bet you he wasn't. But finding those census documents gives me more of a picture, because in the case of Lacey, it led me to relatives of his who had very interesting lives and probably were inspirations to him. So that's a long answer, but all I'm saying is, if you're going to do this research, be prepared to go in any direction, because you never know when you're going to find that piece of information that helps you to tell the story.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much for that answer. And it was an inspiring answer, Donna. I have my last question now for Steve. And then if you do have any questions for our panelists, please do ask them in the Q&A. We'll have a few minutes at the end of this panel for questions. So Steve, one of the highlights of the 1921 season was that amazing all New York World Series between the New York Giants and the New York Yankees. You and Lyle Spatz have written an award-winning book about the 1921 season and that World Series. Could you tell us something about some of the things that impressed you most about the World Series, and also if you encountered anything while doing research on that series that surprised you?
Thanks again, Sharon. I think I've got a couple things, but I want to swing over to something that John and Donna have really triggered in my mind, and I hadn't even thought about it. It wasn't top of mind, but the Yankees got into the World Series in 21 because they beat the Cleveland Indians in a key series right at the end of the season. And in our research, we came across an account that 2 young boys were sitting behind third base at one of these big games. And the sports reporter who told the story overheard the boys. And this was like one of the biggest games in baseball history. Actually, Fred Lieb called one of those games one of the 10 greatest games in baseball history. And the reporter overheard one boy saying to his friend, "I wish I was in Times Square now." Now, they had reader boards, as Donna talks about the fact that they were with chalk. Some of them, the more elaborate ones, actually had little light bulbs, and you had the diamond, and it was a thrilling thing. And it almost seems preposterous to think that two boys that were at a game would wish that they were at Times Square, where their imagination could take over. And I had the opportunity at a SABR convention, I don't remember when, what year, a few years ago, where I met Eric Rolf Greenberg, who has written arguably the greatest baseball novel of all time, The Celebrant, about the early 20th century and McGraw and the Giants. And when I told him this story, his eyes just lit up. He could understand it, even though most people, to hear that story, would think it's crazy. We even have one account in the beginning of the 21 World Series Game 1, when Babe Ruth stepped at the plate. The fans in Times Square and other places saw the little light bulbs going from the pitcher's mound to the batter's box, which is where Babe Ruth was, and just the excitement that you could almost hear from the fans watching the game. But in terms of the World Series itself, I think one or two of the things that surprised us the most, this was a World Series between John McGraw, who epitomized the dead ball era, and Miller Huggins and his Yankees. And it was really almost a series of John McGraw against Babe Ruth rather than against Huggins, because that was the way the headlines had it. And one of the things that we learned in this research was John McGraw might have been a disciple of the small ball, but number one, he did not believe in bunting, because John McGraw just understood that giving away an out did not make a lot of sense. And he believed in the hit and run, but he did not want to bunt and give an out. The other thing is that John McGraw oftentimes did play for the big inning. And at a key time in the series, when the Giants were down 2-0, 4-0 in Game 3, he played for the big inning. And we learned that a wonderful description that McGraw would oftentimes tell his players to really wait out the pitcher and make that pitcher work and not hit at anything, unless it was just a perfect pitch. And then all of a sudden, maybe before the 4th inning, McGraw would tell the guys, "Now I want you guys to attack everything." And the pitcher, who was grooving the ball because the hitters were so picky, all of a sudden was hammered. And so again, like you said earlier, Sharon, the story is not necessarily as simple as can be. In Game 1 and Game 2, the Yankees won 3-0 in both games. And why did that happen? Everybody thought that Miller Huggins was going to depend on the long ball. Well, Huggins recognized that the Giants had some great pitching in Phil Douglas and Art Neff. And basically, Miller Huggins won those first 2 games by playing small ball. And as much offense as there was in 1921, it's very interesting that when a great pitcher was on the mound, you still had low-scoring games. And we certainly saw that in the World Series of 21.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much for your answer. And I love this story about the little boys. And I think that gets back to what Donna was saying about the feeling of those crowds in who were experiencing it as a group, and how inspiring it is to feel a sport that way. So anyway, that's a fascinating story. Yeah, I think it would be great both ways, but you can't be both places, I guess. We have a couple of good questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to ask the first one now. Our first question is, my understanding is that the first broadcast, so this is the broadcast of a radio baseball game on commercial radio. The first broadcast was a one-off event. What team was the first to broadcast home games on a regular basis for an entire season? So either John or Donna, obviously either of you could answer that one.
I'm going to go with we'll never know. And here's why. Early radio, it's very, very expensive to do baseball games. You're going over telephone lines. Long lines are just brutally expensive for most stations. Okay, if you're Westinghouse or, later if you're RCA, NBC, you've got the money. But if you're some small station in Missoula, Montana, no offense to Missoula, and you want to do a game, for your minor league team, good luck. And in the early days, you're not even allowed to have sponsors because commercial advertising isn't okay until the mid-1920s. So what I've noticed in my research, and maybe John has seen something else or Steve has seen something else, but what I've noticed in my research is that it was gradual. It was like every team in the major leagues started off with a couple of games. And somehow the republic didn't fall because, of course, the owners all believed that the moment you broadcast a game, no one would ever go to the games again. That wasn't the case. The winning teams still kept getting people coming to the games. But my point is, what I've noticed is one year, like 1923, 24, we start seeing 5 or 6 or 7 games, maybe 8. By 1925, we're seeing a few more. In 1926, the Red Sox are on WNAC. They get, I'd say about half the season broadcast. My point is, it's gradual, it's cumulative, and in city after city, you start seeing more games. What accelerates it is when sponsorship becomes okay, when the teams are no longer, when the radio stations rather are no longer footing the cost for the long lines and for getting their people there. We also in the 20s see a lot of recreations, which is a whole panel for a whole nother day. But that's a cheaper way of doing it with the telegraph, the telegraph folks sending you the little ticker tape with, here's who's up, here's who's struck, and you tell the story as if you're at the game. And nobody knows that you're not if you tell a good story. But the idea of like having guys at the park doing if I had a guess, 1926, 1927, and not really till NBC and CBS come along and start doing games on a national basis with sponsorship.
That's great.
I just
Sorry,
want to
Steve.
add, and John will probably pick up on it. We've been talking about radio from the standpoint of the stations. What really struck me is, and I don't have the data, maybe John does, how expensive radios were in the 1920s, and the average household did not have them. They had something called crystal sets. And in my research of Grover Cleveland Alexander, when I talked to his niece, who was in her mid-90s, and then I talked to her again when she was in her late 90s, living in St. Paul, Nebraska, she described in the 1926 World Series, everybody went down to Grandma's house because Grandma had a crystal set, and we listened to Grover be the hero of that 26 series. So only Grandma in that group of people had that crystal set. So
but you know what else they had, Steve? A lot of department stores sensing an opportunity to sell radios. Like 1920, 21, 22, 23, you want a radio, you build it, okay? But by 23, they're starting to look better. They're starting to be easier to use. They gradually move away from crystal sets into something that sounds a lot better. And department stores, seeing an opportunity, start putting public speakers on the front of their department store. And instead of gathering at Newspaper Row, you gather in front of the department store and you can listen to the game that way. So there are opportunities in addition to Grandma. But you're right, it's like when the first TV came along, you found out who in the neighborhood had a TV set and you suddenly decided to go over to their house.
I'd throw in that I see a note that there was an advertisement in a Pittsburgh paper in September of 1920, so a year before all of this, selling amateur wireless sets for $10 and up. So I suspect that probably the way that it worked is people went to the store, they heard the speakers blaring outside, they're like, I need to get some of this at home. And Bingo. They took their amateur wireless at home.
And in fact, WNAC, and they were not the only ones to do this, but the late, great John Shepard III, who ran the station WNAC in Boston and also broadcast the Red Sox and Braves games, he put his station on the 5th floor of his department store. And you could watch live broadcasts. Oh, wait, you had to walk through the entire department store to get to the live broadcast. And as you went, there were salespeople. Hey, would you like to buy a radio? Here's the phonograph records. So capitalism, it's a beautiful thing.
Thank you for all of you having good answers to that. And I would add, there's also a good piece on the 1921 Project website about Wrigley, because Wrigley was in advertising. He was a part owner of the Cubs, and he was a very early owner to say that he was fine with radio stations broadcasting Cubs games because he realized radio's broadcast could help increase attendance and it wouldn't decrease attendance. Most owners thought the opposite was true at the time. So that he played an important role as well. And that's the very early 20s. So we do have another question and we have just enough time. So our question is, how good was Graham McNamee as a baseball broadcaster? I've read a lot of diverging opinions. Some say he was great. I guess we have an opinion already. Others that he would broadcast a totally different game from the one actually taking place. That's the question.
This is a case where we actually do have people's comments. Jocko Maxwell, hint, hint, I wrote a piece about him for SABR. But even if I hadn't, Jocko Maxwell said the reason he got into radio was he listened to Graham McNamee and just thought like, ew. And it wasn't jealousy or anything like, wow, he's on the radio. It was like the guy didn't know when to shut up. I'm accused of the same thing. And unfortunately, there was no, in fairness to Graham McNamee, there was no standard back then. It wasn't like, well, he came up through the ranks and he learned how to do all of these people were doing it on the fly. But we have a number of comments, and not just from Jocko Maxwell, about Graham McNamee was better when he did entertainment and when he did other things, okay? But when he tried to do sports, he ended up just, telling you the story of his life rather than calling the games. And that was problematic for some people. On the other hand, everyone said he was enthusiastic. He loved baseball. He loved sports in general. And for his time, I think you got to just give him his proper respect because there was no standard and he was trying his best, as were they all.
Great, thank you. And on that note, we've run out of time. So thank you all. This was a fantastic panel. It was a real honor for me to talk to all of you about these questions and a delight to work with all of you, by the way, on the 1921 web project. You were just fantastic. So I understand Jacob is going to come in now to wrap up this panel officially and usher people into the next one. So Jacob, take it away.
All right, thank you, Sharon, and thank you, John and Donna and Steve, for a fantastic conversation about the SABR Century project and the 1921 baseball season. That's one of those projects that has been a lot of fun for me to work on, especially with Sharon, who's a terrific project manager on this entire series. And it's been great to learn more about the 1921 season and the first radio broadcast, and the Negro Leagues and the World Series and everything else. So this has been a really fun conversation, and we're going to continue on to talk more about 1921, a significant event in baseball history. This is the trial of the century, at least in baseball's world. The Black Sox trial happened 100 years ago in the summer of 1921. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that trial and what happened and all the some of the misconceptions about what really happened in that courtroom in Chicago 100 years ago this summer. So I'm going to introduce our three panelists today, and we'll have a conversation about the Black Sox scandal. First up, we have Bruce Allardice. He is a professor of history at South Suburban College near Chicago. And he has authored numerous articles on the Black Sox, along with biographies of the gamblers who helped fix the 1919 World Series for the SABR Bio Project. His article on the spread of baseball in the South prior to 1870 received the McFarland SABR Baseball Research Award in 2013. So welcome, Bruce.
Thank you. Thank you, Jacob.
Next up, we have Bill Lamb. Bill is the author of Black Sox in the Courtroom, the Grand Jury, Criminal Trial, and Civil Litigation. And he is also a 2019 recipient of the Bob Davids Award, Sabres' highest honor. He's the editor of The Inside Game, the quarterly newsletter of Sabres' Dead Ball Era Committee. And he has been a key contributor to all of Sabres' Black Sox research over the last 10 years and counting, including our 8 Myths Out project in 2019 and our Scandal on the South Side book in 2015. And prior to his retirement, he spent more than 30 years as a state and county prosecutor in New Jersey. So he has a unique perspective on the Black Sox legal proceedings. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Jacob. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you great.
Success.
Finally,
okay, I can let my wife go now.
All good. And thank you to Barbara for helping us out getting Bill connected today. And finally, our third panelist is Don Zminda. Don is the author of a new book called Double Plays and Double Crosses, The Black Sox and Baseball in 1920. Don has written for or edited more than a dozen other baseball books, including several contributions to SABR digital library publications like the 1959 White Sox book. He spent more than 2 decades working for Stats LLC, first as the director of publications and then as the company's director of research for sports broadcast. Welcome, Don.
Hi, Jacob. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Wonderful.
All right. Well, thank you all for being part of this panel and joining us for this discussion about the Black Sox trial. Just to bring everyone up to speed, if you haven't been keeping up with our SABR Committee's research over the last 10 or 20 years, we've learned a lot about the Black Sox scandal in recent years. I like to call it a cold case, not a closed case. That was a phrase used by Gene Carney, our founding chairman of the Black Sox Scandal Committee. And it's all true. You know, we're still learning more. We continue to learn more even now about the Black Sox scandal and what happened with the fixing of the 1919 World Series and all of the legal proceedings that happened. And that's what we're going to focus on today. And just to, again, if you, haven't been keeping up with the research and just want a little bit of an overview of what happened, the 8 members of the Chicago White Sox were bribed by gamblers to fix the 1919 World Series. And they lost to the Cincinnati Reds. And some of this was mentioned, although not very much, on the Field of Dreams game earlier this week in Iowa. You didn't hear too much about Shoeless Joe Jackson and Eddie Seacott and the other Black Sox players. It was mostly focused on the movie, and we're going to learn more about the real story with the Black Sox scandal. And after the 1919 World Series happened, there were a lot of rumors about the Black Sox fixing the World Series, but there wasn't a whole lot of concrete evidence. It was mostly just talk. There were people inside the game who were aware of the fix early on, possibly even before the World Series happened. And then after the World Series ended, there were a lot of rumors. There were even some articles written in newspapers like Collier's Eye. It was a gambling publication in Chicago. They were the first ones to report on the names of the players who were suspected to fix the World Series. There were enough rumors that Charles Comiskey, the White Sox owner, hired private detectives to go out and spy on his players during the offseason of 1919 and 1920. But eventually he ended up bringing almost all the players back. Chick Gandil, the ringleader of the White Sox fix, and the first baseman of the team, was the only one of the Black Sox who did not come back for the 1920 season. He was in a little bit of a salary dispute, and we'll talk a little bit more about Charles Comiskey later on. But all season long in 1920, there were whispers about the White Sox continuing to throw games, and not just because of the 1919 World Series, but also they were said to be throwing games in the 1920 season as well. Bruce, you've done a lot of research on the 1920 season and the possibility that the White Sox fixed games that year as well. What do we know about their 1920 season that leads us to believe that they were continuing to throw games?
Well, first of all, Jacob, thank you for having me on. And it's great to be with Bill and Don again. People who are experts, but I like to consider friends as well. Yes, 1920. The Sox were throwing games in 1920. Every clean White Sox player, several Black Sox, many of their opponents, and even the umpires, they all said that the White Sox were throwing games in 1920 as well. And yeah, I had an article on that in the Baseball Research Journal of 2016. Now, how many games? We don't know for sure. Some have identified up to a dozen games. The ones that are most suspicious that all the historians really have concentrated on are 4 games at the end of August. 1 game against the Yankees, and then the next 3 games against the Red Sox. These were visiting games. At the time, the White Sox were in first place, but they lost all 4, and they looked very bad doing so. Chicago Tribune's respected sports reporter, E.I. Sandberg, sourly observed that Risberg in the New York game, Risberg and Weaver were the best players New York had today. And that Joe Jackson ran bases like a high school boy. But during the Boston series, one Boston sports writer looked at the Sox's play, and remembering, he cried out, they're playing just like they played in the 1919 World Series. Clean Sox Eddie Collins and other players specifically mentioned the Red Sox series as the series they believed was thrown. And in that series, the 7 remaining Black Sox committed error after error. They didn't hit the clutch, and the team scored only 5 runs in those 3 games. In a 1949 article, Collins was more specific. It was in Boston, he said, that the incident happened that cost us the 1920 pennant. Some gamblers got panicky that we'd win again, and they must have got to the players they had under their thumb and ordered the rest of the games thrown. We, the Clean Sox, knew something was wrong, but we couldn't put a finger on it. Collins also told Joe Williams, a sports writer, that the Black Sox threw a half a dozen or a dozen games in 1920, or at least tried to. One of the things about the 7 men out, I guess you'd call them, was that in 1920, they combined for about 30 wins above replacement. And if you look at that, if they weren't playing to win, the Sox would be in trouble for not just winning the pennant, but for winning a game against anybody. Why did they do it? Well, on the one hand, you take a look at it, the potential payoff for throwing a regular season game was less than it would be for a World Series game. If only because the gamblers wagered and would be able to wager less money on a regular season game, and thus there'd be fewer betting profits to pay the players off. Now, we have one story that Buck Weaver was paid $400 for his part in throwing that Boston series in 1920. Now, that's a lot less than the 10 to 20,000 that the gamblers promised the players for the World Series. But if you look at it on another way, the players had already gotten away with the World Series 6. And this is a fix on the biggest stage there was in baseball. Logically, there'd be less media attention to a regular season game. And this time, in a regular season game, the players wouldn't have to deal with a bunch of what Arnold Rothstein called ham and eggers. Guys like Sleepy Bill Burns and Bill Maharg, who were frankly out of their depth trying to arrange a series fix. They'd be dealing with the top-notch gamblers. In this case, probably specifically Sport Sullivan, a big timer, a professional fixer, a professional gambler, a guy who'd been savvy enough to avoid any prosecution for the 1919 fix. I guess just to sum it up, if they got away with it in 1920, 1919 on the big stage, they thought they could get away with it with 1920 on a much smaller stage.
Thank you, Bruce. And, that certainly parallels other scandals in baseball history, including recent ones, where we see that teams are getting away with stuff. And you see other teams that look at that and say, well, if they can if everyone's getting away with it, we're going to try to, raise the bar a little bit higher. And then all of a sudden you've got a World Series scandal. That's something that we can certainly relate to in the 21st century as well. This is, again, the 1920 season. You've got these, rumors going around, and certainly by the end of September, the talk is getting much, much louder, in part because there was a grand jury called in Chicago at the beginning of September to investigate gambling in baseball. And the grand jury was called not because of the 1919 World Series at first, but because of a fix between a Cubs and Phillies game at the end of August. that was said to be fixed. And then it expanded its scope to talk more about the 1919 World Series. Bruce, do you think the White Sox players knew that the walls were closing in by this time, and maybe that made them more brazen to start throwing even more games in September?
Yeah, I think they had to suspect that the walls were closing in. There's reports about Eddie Seacott being moody and, not being able to sleep at night, be under the pressure and all that. There's the theory, of course, that they knew they were going to get caught eventually. So they figured, let's cash in for as much as we possibly can while we're still playing. In other words, throw more 1919 season games. It's hard to, the Black Sox never spoke, to my memory, specifically on that point. They were trying to be a little reluctant, I think, about their 1920 fix operations, but they had, the $400 that they got for throwing one series, well, for the average player, that's about 10% of their yearly salary. On the level of today, that'd be $60,000 just to throw a game, throw a series. So we're not talking about an inconsiderable payoff for 1920. That can pay, in Seacott's case, for a lot more mortgages on his farm.
That's right. So Don, your book focuses specifically on the 1920 season and what happened through there. And as I mentioned, the grand jury started its focus with a game between the Cubs and the Phillies in late August. And that was the reason that the grand jury was called and what they started investigating. But we've done a lot of research on this era of baseball and just how corrupt it was. It wasn't just the 1919 World Series. Why do you think there were so many game fixing controversies and gambling controversies in this era of baseball?
Well, it certainly was nothing new. Gambling and game fixing have been going on in baseball pretty much since the game had been invented. I think the first scandal that was uncovered took place in 1865, which was before organized baseball even existed. But for most of that time, baseball officials just tended to look the other way because they thought that, if you did a full-scale investigation or some sort of crackdown, it would lead people to question the basic honesty of the game. And as a result, things just got worse and worse. And I think it really came to a head in the years just after World War I. And the problem just started getting too big to ignore. You, Jacob, had wrote about the famous gamblers riot at Fenway Park in 1917, in which a group of gamblers who all sat together in the right field stands at Fenway Park actually tried to stop the game against the White Sox because the White Sox were winning. It looked like it was about to rain, and they felt that if they could delay the game for long enough, the game would get canceled and then they wouldn't lose their bets. That was really pretty brazen. There's also the continuing shenanigans of Hal Chase, who had been accused and rumored or whatever of game fixing over the course of several years, but he always seemed to get away clean, and he never seemed to have a problem finding another employer. Then in 1919, not in the major leagues, but in the Pacific Coast League, which was one of the leading minor leagues, there was a scandal in which players from the Vernon Club were accused of putting together a slush fund to pay off players from other teams so that Vernon's chief rival, the Los Angeles Angels, would win the pennant. And in fact, the Angels did win the pennant. And these scandals really got too big to ignore. There were writers who were looking into things. There was Harry Williams in Los Angeles. There was Bert Collier, who you mentioned. There was Hugh Fullerton, who was on the case really throughout 1919 and 1920. There were James Crusenberry and Jimmy Isaminger. All these guys were looking into things. And I just think the heat got too great. One interesting thing about the August 31st case that you mentioned that involved a possible fix, on the part of Claude Hendricks of the Cubs. That was really what started the grand jury investigation. But I think the key people in that case were William Wrigley, who was president of the Cubs, and William Beck, Bill Veck's father, who was his right-hand man and the key Cub official. They had all seen what had happened in the Pacific Coast League in 1919, because William Wrigley also won the Los Angeles Angels of the PCL. So these guys were very concerned about what was going on in baseball. And I think they just shed so much heat on this that things just finally boiled over and came to a head.
Yeah, that's right. And the Pacific Coast League scandal, you know, we probably outside the scope of this panel discussion, but certainly as Bill wrote in his book, Black Sox in the Courtroom, the Pacific Coast League scandal played a huge role in setting a precedent, in banning the players. And Judge Landis looked at that case and that scandal, you know, for inspiration in some ways into how he handled the Black Sox later in 1921. And so that's, you know, one of many situations that we've seen in that era with game fixing and how baseball was going to handle it. There was still a question of that. So this grand jury begins in early September. And for the first 3 weeks of the grand jury, it kind of plods along. It doesn't call anybody consequential. There's a lot of people like John McGraw and people involved with the New York Giants, including Rube Benton, the pitcher, who really made the first break in the case around September 24th, in which he testified to the grand jury that Hal Chase had approached him talking about the World Series fix that was to come a week later, trying to get him in on it to win some money. And then very quickly after that, the snowball started. And in Philadelphia on September 27th, you've got an interview by Billy Mahard, one of the gamblers, one of the insiders. And he was the first person who was really directly involved in the World Series fix to admit publicly that the World Series had been fixed. And then one day after that, you've got Eddie Seacott waking up in Chicago, and he goes to the grand jury, goes to Charles Comiskey's office, and then eventually to the grand jury that day to testify. And Shoeless Joe Jackson follows him, and Lefty Williams follows him a day later to testify to the grand jury. But Bill's written also about, you know, how unusual this grand jury was and the proceedings were. Unusual in a number of different ways from normal grand jury proceedings. The grand jury eventually indicted all 8 of the Black Sox players and 5 gamblers, Abe Attell, Bill Burns, Sport Sullivan, Hal Chase, and somebody by the name of Brown. And those were the 5 gamblers who were initially indicted in October of 1920. Bill, how were these grand jury proceedings so unusual?
Well, Jacob, as you mentioned, the proceedings were sprawling and unfocused. The grand jury was impaneled to inquire into reports that a meaningless Phillies and Cubs game in late August had been fixed. But then it quickly morphs into an inquiry into the integrity of the 1919 World Series. All the while they're doing that, they're also conducting proceedings into allegations of corruption and game fishing in the National League. Simultaneously, they're also making an inquiry into the Chicago pool selling rackets. So instead of focusing on one particular crime, it's sort of an unfocused investigation that has any number of different targets. One thing I would mention that makes it unusual is that the mandate of grand jury secrecy was ignored throughout the proceedings. Now, I suspect that quite a few of our viewers have pulled jury duty or certainly have been in a courtroom, and even if they haven't done that, they've seen Law and Order and Perry Mason and what have you. So they have a pretty good idea of what a jury does. Grand jury proceedings are entirely different. They're totally one-sided, and that's because the exercise has as its objective not this deciding of guilt or innocence, but really a determination of whether or not a crime has been committed, and if it has been, who should be charged with it. As a result, these proceedings are conducted in secret. There's no press, there's no public. There's also no judge, no defense lawyer. The target of the investigation is not present unless he is called as a witness. The grand jury room is confined to the prosecutor, clerical staff, the 23 grand jurors, and the witness on the stand. And these proceedings are conducted in rigorous secrecy. That was the law 100 years ago in Chicago. That's the law now, and that's the law everywhere in the country, as far as I know, except in this case, for reasons that are difficult to justify, but apparently it was the view that baseball would profit from having its dirty laundry aired in public and have the game purged. An exception was made, and the proceedings were leaked on a regular basis. And you could read, sometimes verbatim, the testimony in the following day's press. That tended to, well, it may not have complicated the proceedings, but it certainly made them different. If you want me to go on farther, I can explain some other things that complicated getting this case to trial. But that basically explains why these proceedings are so much different than what you would ordinarily encounter in a grand jury, which focuses on a specific incident, an armed robbery, a rape, a homicide, and the investigation which led to the arrest of a particular defendant or defendants. In this case, it was sprawling and unfocused and resulted, among other things, with the charging of eight White Sox players and 5 gamblers.
No, that's a great point. And you mentioned, that the case was very complicated. It took another 9 months before we got to trial. It didn't start until June of 1921. And in the middle of that, there was, all kinds of legal, maneuvering, both on the prosecution side and the defense side, before this case ever got to trial in June of 1921. Can you give a little bit of a summary of what happened there and why that case, was so complicated to bring to trial?
Sure. First of all, you have to understand that life is not like television. You don't have a crime committed, a defendant arrested, a commercial, and a trial starting 2 minutes later. Criminal trials are complicated. There are all sorts of pretrial proceedings that have to be conducted that elongate the process. But in this case, there were additional complications, the first of which had to do with the 1920 November elections. The grand jury prosecutors were members of the staff of Maclay Hoyne, a Democrat. The Democrats were defeated in the election, and starting in December, a brand new prosecutor and an entirely new staff are coming into office, and they know nothing about this case. To make matters worse, when they do get in office, they discover that the investigation has all sorts of problems. It's incomplete. There's material missing from the files. Most importantly, I think, was the prosecution was premised on the notion that 3 of the defendants, Jackson, Seacott, and Williams, they admitted their complicity before the grand jury. We will get at least one of these guys, probably Eddie Seacott, to flip, and he will then give us the key to presenting the case to the grand jury, except it doesn't happen. Negotiations with the Seacott founder, Jackson and Williams, get their own lawyer, and they're not cooperating either. And all of a sudden, the prosecutors don't have this inside witness that they need to make sense of this sprawling, multi-defendant, multi-act conspiracy. So they beg for time. They make a motion for a continuance before Judge Deaver. They want 6 more months. Now, usually these things are sort of granted as a matter of course. And it was expected that Deaver would go along, except he didn't. He basically told the prosecutors, you're the ones who charged this case. You didn't have to, but you did. The defense in this case, the ball players, have been suspended. They say they're innocent, but they can't make a living as long as these charges are still over their head. You're going to go to trial, and you're going to go to trial soon. You're going to go to trial May 2nd. The third thing that complicates and elongates the process is that the prosecutors now do something smart. For tactical reasons, they don't take an unready case involving multiple defendants to trial. Rather, they administratively dismiss the charges, which is their prerogative. But within days, they represent the case on an expedited basis to a new grand jury and get a superseding indictment, which not only recharges all of the original defendants, but adds 5 more defendants to the roster. This, in my estimation, was a tactical mistake, adding these Midwestern tin horns, but that's neither here nor there for the time being. What happens is that by returning a superseding indictment, the judicial clock goes back to square one. The prosecution now gets the time needed to put their case in order, or at least in better order, and to find and flip Bill Burns, who will give them at least someone who was inside the conspiracy and can describe who did what, at least in his presence. So there's other factors too, but these in particular are what elongated and complicated the process in getting this case to trial.
Thanks, Bill. Before we get to the trial itself, I want to remind everybody, if you have any questions for our panelists today, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom control panel, and we'll try to get to those at the end of the discussion here. Bruce, you've done a lot of research on the gamblers, especially these Midwestern tin horns, who actually stood trial with the Black Sox players in 1921. Initially, I named off the 5 bigger names who were indicted, Abetell and Bill Burns among them. But the biggest name of all was missing, Arnold Rothstein. He escaped indictment altogether. And so when the trial began in 1921, only these 5 low-level gamblers from Iowa and St. Louis and Indiana were co-defendants with the Black Sox. Why do you think they were the only ones who faced prosecution in this case?
Well, but Bill touched on that, I think, a little bit in his presentation. They can be described as low level, certainly. Ham and Eggers, again, is how Rothstein mentioned a couple of them, and nobody, and especially the prosecution, believed that they had the savvy or the resources to be major players in a fix of this size. And I think the defense attorneys throughout the trial emphasized the fact, hey, why are these guys being indicted? Why are they on trial? Why aren't the Rothsteins and the Sullivans and the Odells in the courtroom? And I think that had a sway with the jury. Now, how did these guys get into the fix? Well, they seem to have latched on to the fix as hangers-on. They're the kind of guys who heard about a good thing, heard about rumors. Some of them had the connections with Abe Attell. One of them, Carl Zork, had actually promoted one of Attell's fights in St. Louis, a fight, by the way, that there were a lot of accusations that the fight that he promoted was fixed too. But they were cashing in on a pre-existing conspiracy. They weren't part of the central part of the conspiracy, and they weren't major players in it either. These are guys who gambled in hundreds of dollars. And that's a whole different level from the tens of thousands of dollars that a Sports Sullivan or an Arnold Rothstein regularly dealt with. In fact, when one of the St. Louis gamblers tried to place a $5,000 bet with the local bookie that he bet with all his life, the bookie was so astonished at the size of the bet, much greater than this gambler had ever bet before, that the bookie tried to actually warn Major League Baseball, hey, something funny is going on. Why were they the only gamblers to face prosecution? Why weren't Attell, Rothstein, and Sullivan brought to trial, as you correctly point out? I think a big part of it is evidence or lack of evidence. The big boys were too savvy to leave much of a paper trail, or to have too many direct dealings with the players. And just on another angle, I'd like to think that Cook counties didn't have the resources really in manpower or time or money to pull off a prosecution of this size. It may seem odd to us today, but in 1920, Arnold Rothstein probably had more time and money to fight the prosecution against him than Cook County had time and money to prosecute him. Only 2 people could tie Rothstein directly to the fix, Attell and Sullivan. And Arnold Rothstein made sure that neither of them was brought to trial. The fact that Abe Attell beat even an order for extradition speaks volumes here. Now, extradition is where a person commits is indicted for a crime, let's say in one state, the person is known to be in another state, and the first state, in this case, Illinois, puts in a request for New York to arrest and send the guy to Chicago, in this case, for trial. Now, the extradition papers were signed in Illinois. They were sent to New York along with a witness, a guy named Sam Pass, to identify Attell in court in the extradition hearing. But Rothstein, again, he had a mouthpiece attorney who was a notorious fixer called Bill Fallon. And the story is that Fallon simply bribed the witness to have a sudden loss of memory, Witness suddenly said, "Oh yeah, I said Abe Attell was part of the fix, but I can't be sure that this is the Abe Attell I was mentioning." You know, nobody believed that for a second, but it was enough for a New York court to deny extradition. Now, I think it's delicious what Bill Burns said at trial after some pretty clever questioning by a defense attorney. He said, in essence, if we had a smart guy like you arranging things for us low-level guys, we'd all be rich today. Bill Lamb is, I think, written the best work on why they were properly acquitted, these low-level gamblers. The evidence against them was weak, and so weak that the Black Sox trial judge dismissed the charges against several of them and said, if it goes to a jury verdict and a jury verdict guilty, I'm going to void the verdict because it just wasn't the evidence against these guys.
Yeah, and we'll get into the verdict in just a few minutes. Don, how do you think the rest of the baseball world reacted to the Black Sox going to trial? This is not a situation that we see very often in sports, where athletes do something presumably on the field, fixing World Series games, but then face consequences in the courtroom. This is not something that we see very often in baseball or in any other sports. How did the rest of the baseball world react?
Well, if you start with their teammates, one of the first things that happened when the players were indicted was that a lot of the members of the Clean Sox threw a party to celebrate. I mean, they were just so relieved that this had finally come into the open. They felt that they had been playing under a shadow the entire season. And I think their primary reaction was relief. And contrary to the myth that would later develop that there was a wall of silence among the players in regard to talking about the scandal. I mean, Jacob, you've written about this yourself. A number of the members of the team spoke at length to reporters, just saying how they were relieved that the evidence against the Black Sox had finally come to light. And I think it's important to note that really none of the Clean Sox spoke up in defense of either Joe Jackson or Buck Weaver. They considered them guilty along with the other 6 players. And that really didn't change even after the players were found not guilty in the trial in 1921. As far as the press were concerned, I think at first there was a lot of unanimity in condemning these guys. I mean, there's the famous Sporting News graphic right after the players were indicted, "Fix these faces in your memory," like the members of Murder One and Murder Incorporated had been indicted. It was a pretty strong reaction against the players. There would be a backlash against Charles Comiskey in particular that would put the Black Sox in a more sympathetic light, but that really didn't happen until several years later. As far as fans were concerned, I think they were a lot more split. A lot of White Sox fans looked on these players and Jackson and Weaver in particular as sympathetic figures. But really at the time, I don't think there was some great campaign to get these guys reinstated. Among baseball officials, I honestly think the primary reaction on their part was embarrassment, because all this stuff had gone undetected by them, uninvestigated by them, except for Comiskey on his own. And really, I think that they really needed to do something to show that they were in favor of clean baseball, which is something they hadn't done before. And that really directly led to the instatement of Landis as commissioner. I think they needed some stern father figure, somebody who was going to restore faith in baseball, because frankly, when the indictments came out, people's faith had been lost. I mean, why didn't baseball investigate it? Where was the National Commission? People like Hugh Fullerton have been writing about this stuff for months, and yet really nothing or next to nothing had been done. So that really led pretty directly into the election of Landis as commissioner, and he wanted absolute power. They had no feeling at all to defend themselves. They had to give him absolute power to restore faith in the game, and that's where all of Landis's power came from.
That's right. And we don't have time to get into this today, but, American League President Ban Johnson was one of the drivers of how this case got to trial. And one of the reasons for that was his feud with Charles Comiskey. He wanted to take down his former best friend and partner and take down this championship team he had built in Chicago. And so that's one of the reasons we even got to trial, was because Ban Johnson spent so much of the American League's money, going after Bill Burns and Billy Maharg, trying to get them to become witnesses for the prosecution and get this case to trial. And so all of those power dynamics play into, why this case even came to trial, and then, how baseball handled it in the aftermath. To talk a little bit specifically about the trial itself, we have written about this many times, and Bill's book, Black Sox in the Courtroom, is really the defining work on this subject. But there's a lot of misconceptions about, how the trial played out. The general story, the traditional story, is that it was, a bungling prosecution, and there were all these shenanigans involving the Chicago mob and Arno Rothstein, possibly partnering with Charles Comiskey. None of that was really true, and there's no evidence to believe that. But the biggest myth of all about the Black Sox trial is the idea that the confessions of Eddie Seacott, Shoeless Joe Jackson, and Lefty Williams were stolen before the trial. And many people believe, and still believe, that this is what sunk the prosecution's case, and this is why the Black Sox were acquitted. There's a very dramatic scene in the 8 Men Out film in 1988, basically making that case. But we know now that that is not true at all, that this was really a minor incident in the trial, and that the confessions were part of the record. Bill, can you explain why this whole story has been built up, and why it had so little effect on the actual trial itself?
Well, Jacob, as far as I can tell, the myth of the missing confessions is one of fairly recent origin. It is entirely the product of the 1988 John Sayles film version of 8 Men Out, my unfavorite movie. But prior to that, that was not a major theme of the Black Sox saga. What you have to understand is how grand jury transcripts were memorialized back in the day. Prior to the advent of modern sound devices, grand jury testimony was taken down in shorthand by grand jury stenographers using pen and pencil. Thereafter, as time and circumstance would permit, they would take their notes and then type them into a formal transcript. And that transcript would then be sent to the prosecutor's office for safekeeping, in this case, the evidence vault of the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. Sometime in early 1921, when the new prosecutors came on board, they discovered that the transcripts, the original transcripts of the grand jury testimony of Eddie Seacott, Joe Jackson, and Lefty Williams were missing. And they reported that to the court, by the way, and it wasn't a secret. But the remedy wasn't all that complicated either. They simply had the court reporters, Walter Smith and Elbert Allen, retrieve their stenographic notes and retype the transcripts. When the case came to trial, the Black Sox defense made no claim that these second generation transcripts were inaccurate, inauthentic, or otherwise bogus. Rather, they maintained that the confessions shouldn't come in because they were obtained in violation of the due process rights of the defendants. In other words, they're claiming that they would not have testified but for off-the-record promises of leniency, which were then broken. There's a mid-trial hearing on that before Judge Friend, out of the presence of the jury, in which Jackson, Seacott, and Williams testify. The proofs are limited to what happened in and about the grand jury room. Nothing about the fix itself can be covered. And on the other side, you have Judge McDonald, the presiding judge of the grand jury prosecutor, Hartley Reprogel, and the White Sox corporate counsel, Alfred Austrian. And it becomes a swearing contest, and the prosecution wins. And so the confessions are admitted in evidence, but Judge Friend determines they must be redacted. In other words, what Seacott said, which incriminated himself and the others, that's fine for the jury to hear as it pertains to him. but it's not fair and it's hearsay as it pertains to Chick Gandler, Buck Weaver. They can't cross-examine a piece of paper. So you're going to have to take these confessions back to the office and redact them. And so every time that CCOT mentions Weaver's name or Jackson's name or McMullen's name or Reesberg's name, that's got to be stricken. So when the time comes, the transcripts are read to the grand jury at the trial jury, rather, at excruciating length. The courtroom is not air conditioned. It's the heat. It's the height of the Chicago summer. It's boiling in there. You have Special Prosecutor Prindeville and Court Reporter Smith droning on question, answer, and I'm sure the jurors went face down very quickly. In any event, what happens is that before the grand jury, Eddie CCOT had said the people involved in the fix were Chick Gandle, Joe Jackson, Swede Reesberg, Buck Weaver, blah, 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 and myself. When it comes time for the trial, CCOT, answer. Those involved in the six were Mr. Blank, Mr. Blank, Mr. Blank, Mr. Blank, Mr. Blank, Mr. Blank, and Mr. Blank, and me. And this goes on for probably several hours. Now, when all is said and done, jurors aren't brain damaged. They can pretty well figure out who CCOT and Jackson and Williams are talking about. And so when they go to deliberate, they know that three of the defendants that confessed and the Mr. Blanks, they're the guys sitting next to them at the defense table. But it doesn't matter because they're going to quit them all anyway. That's another topic we'll get to shortly, I suspect. But the bottom line is that even Elliot Asinoff in 1963, in his book, he acknowledged that the confessions were in fact admitted against the defendants. It's only until 1988 that this myth, which now pervades the popular consciousness regarding the scandal, is created. But Asinoff isn't blameless here either because he co-wrote that script with John Sayles, and he knew better, but he did it anyway. But the bottom line is that it is the pervasive myth regarding the trial of the Black Sox case. It makes a dramatic scene in the movie. It's totally bogus.
And of course, you know, every few years we get an auction house or some profiteering company that wants to offer a reward. We had one a few years ago. They were offering $1 million for the stolen confessions if anyone could produce them. And, you know, of course, they don't exist. You know, there were no signed confessions. The stolen confessions were found, you know, within weeks and recreated. So it's a reward for headlines only. There is, you know, no stolen confession. There's no signed confession anywhere in existence. So you mentioned the jury bill, and it on August 2nd, 1921, it took the jury less than 3 hours to deliberate and return with a not guilty verdict on all counts. And you've written before that the jury probably made up its mind pretty early on, possibly even before the confessions were reread into the record and put everybody to sleep in that hot courtroom. And you've also made the case that the prosecution, you know, had a pretty solid case, especially against the three players who confessed to the grand jury, CCOT, Jackson, and Williams, and that the jurors may have had other reasons, some that they spoke about publicly, or maybe not publicly, but on the record, and some that were more unspoken, that may explain their verdict. How do we understand the jury's decision now, 100 years later?
Well, the bottom line, Jacob, is that the basis for the jury's verdict is unknowable. All we can do is speculate based upon what we know about the circumstances of the trial. It's my thesis that the jury verdict, at least as it pertains to certain charges against certain defendants, is a product of a thing called jury nullification. And jury nullification is a phenomenon which mercifully does not often occur in the criminal courthouse, but is one that prosecutors dread. And usually it involves cases that involve a highly charged public matter. And what motivates it, jurors are instructed, and they take an oath to abjure passion, prejudice, and any untoward emotion, and to decide the case exclusively based upon the evidence they receive in court and the instruction on the law they receive from the judge. That's it. And usually, in the overwhelming majority of cases, that's what they do, but not always. In the Black Sox case, Well, speaking generally first, why do they do that? Well, they may take a collective dislike to the victim, or they may empathize or sympathize with the accused, or the jury may decide that it is important through their verdict to send a message or to make a public statement of overarching importance. The most notorious example of this is a recent one. It's the acquittal of O.J. Simpson. The jurors in that case knew that Simpson had done the murders, but the not guilty verdict returned by an all-minority jury was payback for the recent acquittal of the white cops who beat down Rodney King. And many of them have, frankly, come out and admitted it. In this case, what you have is an attempt by the defense from the very beginning to cultivate a bond from jury selection forward between the blue-collar white males who were stood on the jury and the ball player defendants, who are products of the same working class back that they are. And you can see as the case progresses, it works, and it's reflected in the verdict itself. The jury is given the case. You have multiple defendants. You have 9 defendants left, and you have a plethora of charges against each. Less than 3 hours later, the jury is back with a verdict which acquits all defendants on all charges. That alone suggests to you that they didn't deliberate. They just went in, had a cup of coffee, and said, let's go back out. What's more telling, however, is what happens after the verdict is announced in court. There's a celebration, and the jurors join in. Not only have they returned an undeliberated verdict of not guilty, they're happy about it. They are joining the defendants in celebration in the courthouse. Later on that evening, there's a famous picture, a photograph taken on the courthouse steps of the Chicago Tribune showing the defendants, the jurors, and their lawyers. And you can't tell who's the happiest. And finally, of course, there's the celebration conducted into the wee hours of the morning between the defendants and I should say the ball player defendants and the jurors who just acquitted them. Now, I'm of the view that the key to, I shouldn't go into this, or maybe it has to do with conspiracy law and it gets rather complicated. I think I want to take up all the time here. So we'll save that for another day. But let me tell you this. The prosecution presented an overwhelming case against Joe Jackson, Eddie Seacott, and Lefty Williams, and a strong, albeit circumstantial case against Chick Yandel, Swede Reisberg, and the gambler David Zeltzer. Against the others, not so much. And against the Levi brothers, the case was an embarrassment. But as it pertains to the conspiracy charges returned against Eddie Seacott, Joe Jackson, and Lefty Williams, the verdict is contrary to the weight of the evidence and can only be explained, at least in my estimation, as the product of jury nullification. The state rests, Your Honor.
And this is why we have Bill for that perspective from his own professional career and his own expertise on these legal proceedings. So, you know, the Black Sox were, of course, acquitted at trial, but the very next day, Judge Landis made it clear that baseball could and would clean up its own mess, quote, regardless of the verdict of juries, in his famous proclamation banning the Black Sox for life a day later, 100 years ago this month. Don, do you think the lifetime ban was necessary given the players' differing degrees of guilt? And do you think it was effective in how it cleaned up the game from all the corruption that had been going on in those years?
I do think it was a necessary step in 1921 because people had lost faith in the honesty of the game. If you look just past 1921, what happens in 1922? There's a guy named Phil Douglas who offers to lay down to prevent his own team, the New York Giants, from winning the pennant. He writes a letter to a player on another team, Les Mann. Les Mann immediately reports this to Judge Landis. and Phil Douglas gets thrown out of baseball. 1924, at the end of the season, the Giants are playing the Phillies. One of the players on the Giants goes to Heine Sand, the shortstop from the Phillies, and offers him a bribe for throwing the game. Sand immediately reports this. O'Connell gets thrown out of baseball. You could argue that other people should have gotten punished as well, but nonetheless, Judge Landis took swift action against this, and people felt somebody was working to keep the game honest. This is something that had not happened before Judge Landis became commissioner. So I do think it was a necessary step. If you go farther into the future, say late 20s, early 30s, Joe Jackson wants to play for a minor league team in his own area and comes to Judge Landis and says, you know, can you lift this ban so I can play? Judge Landis says, no, I don't want anything to do with this. I think that was a little tough, but at the same time, Joe Jackson never came clean. He always maintained his innocence. He kept changing his story repeatedly to make himself look better. Weaver was the same way. Weaver is a sympathetic figure for a lot of people, but Weaver deliberately lied on what he knew and what had happened. So when Weaver goes to Landis and tries to get reinstatement, even though he's a sympathetic figure, I think Landis had no choice but to keep the ban in place because Weaver had done exactly what Landis had banished him for, which was having the knowledge and not reporting it. So I think it was the right thing to do.
Yeah, that's a great point about Buck Weaver, and I've certainly gone on record probably in both directions of how culpable Buck Weaver was, but there's no denying that he was at the meetings with the gamblers, multiple meetings, including during the World Series. Many people placed him there. Whether he took any money in 1920, is certainly a subject up for debate. We're still trying to follow that money trail. That's something I think both with the 1919 World Series and with the 1920 fixes, that's something that has eluded us, because the people involved obviously didn't talk about it and there's no receipts to find. But yeah, so I mean, those questions are still out there. You mentioned the New York Giants and the 1922 scandal with Phil Douglas, 1924 with Jimmy O'Connell. We've got an audience question about John McGraw and how involved he was with any game fixing incidents. Certainly you've got those two in the 1920s after the Black Sox trial ended. You've also got a few situations before that in which the Giants always seemed to be involved in pretty much any game fixing controversy that came up. The 1919 New York Giants, which hired Hal Chase after he had been exonerated by the Reds in the National League for fixing games there. The 1919 Giants hired Hal Chase, signed him, and he ended up starting a game fixing ring with Heine Zimmerman in 1919. And the 1919 Giants had 8 members of that team that were either suspended or banned for life or just kind of shuffled off. Hey, persona non grata in baseball, we don't want you anymore. They had their own 8 men out in New York under John McGraw. So I think that answers the question, even if we don't know that he was, the mastermind of a fix. McGraw's team certainly was subject to a lot of these rumors. Bruce, just to kind of wrap up before we get to a few audience questions here, what is it about this story, this trial, the entire scandal that continues to resonate, that continues to fascinate baseball fans 100 years later? Why are we still talking about this all these years later and still learning new things?
Why are we still talking? Because it's a darn good story, and it made a darn good, entertaining movie in 8 Men Out. Not maybe accurate, but certainly entertaining. I mean, in this week, we saw the Field of Dreams game, and the players are reenacting the movie's entrance to the Black Sox players through the cornfield. I mean, how many times has Major League Baseball reached back to a movie about any players 100 years ago? The story's got everything. The story has heroes like Ray Schalk, has unexpected heroes like Dickie Kerr. It has villains, Gamble and Rothstein, good people who have given to temptation like Eddie Seacott. It has men caught in the middle of a dilemma like Kid Gleason or owner Charles Comiskey. It has personalities like the semi-literate Joe Jackson. And these are the things that have made a good story in any context. And it's a great mystery too. It's really worthy of Sherlock Holmes. We don't know all the details of the fix even today. And there were so many strands of the fix and so many different plots involved, so many different people involved. It will be impossible to sort everything out. We will never know exactly what happened. We don't know how much money the players actually received. We don't know whether Buck Weaver actually played honestly. We don't know exactly how many games were thrown. We pretty much agreed on games 1, 2, and 8, but the other games, that's still open to debate. Plus, I think it's a classic morality play. It's an almost biblical fall from grace. It's Eve being tempted by the apple. It's Judas accepting his 30 pieces of silver. It's Faust. It's Benedict Arnold selling out George Washington. And if that doesn't make a good story, I don't know what does.
Thank you, Bruce. So we've got time for a couple audience questions here before we wrap up. One question here for Bill. Was there any motion put forth to change the venue of the trial from the Cook County Courthouse in Chicago?
Not that I know of.
Okay. Yeah, this was always a Chicago story from start to finish. Another question here. Does it serve baseball to have these bans go on more than a century later, even after all the players are long dead and gone? I'll open it up to any of you that want to answer that one.
Well, according to John, okay, good, Don.
I would say, yeah, because what a lot of people want, particularly with Jackson and Weaver, they want them to be exonerated. You can't exonerate them. They were guilty. So I just think the ban has to stay. I'm more open about the Hall of Fame, but as far as what they did, I think you got to stay with it.
This is a technical point that I may have misunderstood, but I was under the impression that recently the Hall has, or baseball has, disclaimed that there is any permanent ban on deceased players such as Joe Jackson or Buck Weaver, and that unbeknownst to anybody, the ban expired with them. It was just presumed because they were once banned, the ban continued. So this is a recent development which has changed the equation in terms of the Hall of Fame debate, et cetera. But it's my understanding, and I could be wrong, that the ban is not currently in existence. It died with Buck Weaver and Joe Jackson.
That's right. ESPN reported last year that Major League Baseball has come out and said, basically, they are not considered ineligible. They are not on the ineligible list. If you are no longer living, you cannot be on the ineligible list. And so any questions about their eligibility, about their Hall of Fame case should be directed to the Baseball Hall of Fame, not to Major League Baseball. Now, you can also argue that this is a case of a hot potato and nobody actually wants to answer the question. But Major League Baseball did come out and say that to ESPN last year with the backstory documentary by Don Van Natta. So final thoughts here. Can the Black Sox scandal ever happen again? Bruce, we'll start with you.
Well, I've spoken on that before. No, it can't. Just because of the economics, players make so much money these days, the gamblers could never wager and win enough money on a World Series in order to realistically bribe players making, on average, I don't know what, $600,000 a year. And for the players they would need to bribe, the Mike Trout level, $15 million in bribes. I'm not saying that the players are more honest than they were, or the gamblers were more honest than they were 100 years ago, but the economics and practicalities of the situation preclude that, in my opinion.
Don?
Yeah, totally agree. They just make too much money these days, so it couldn't work.
That's fair. Bill?
Unanimous.
I am in total agreement here. So thank you all. This has been a great panel discussion. We've got another panel on the Black Sox scandal next weekend, hosted by the SABR Chicago chapter. And in that panel, we'll be talking more about the aftermath, the legacy of the Black Sox scandal, Field of Dreams, and all of that. That's at 2:00 Central Time on August 21st. Myself and Bill Lamb will be part of that, along with Willie Steele, Dan Levitt, and Sharon Hamilton. So I hope you'll join us next Saturday. Thank you to Bruce, Bill, and Don for a terrific discussion. This has been great. And as Bruce alluded to, this is a story that continues to live on. We continue to learn more about it. And I hope we do for the next 100 years as well. So we're going to go now to our final panel. This will be a game simulation discussion about the New York Giants, the World Series champions of 1921, and the Chicago American Giants, the Negro National League pennant winners of 1921. So this promises to be a really fantastic discussion again. And I'm going to throw it back to Sharon Hamilton, who will introduce our panelists for the next hour.
Great. Thank you very much, Jacob. So we have some fantastic panelists today to get us in the mood to know what was happening in Negro Leagues baseball and in National League Championship Baseball in 1921, and to pave the way for talking about our championship game that didn't take place, but what would have happened if it had. So first we have Phil Dixon. Phil Dixon is one of the country's foremost authorities on Negro League baseball after spending the past 35 years researching, lecturing, and writing on the subject. He is a co-founder of the Negro League Baseball Museum in Kansas City and previously worked in the public relations office of the Kansas City Royals. So thank you for being here with us, Phil. Then we have John Odell. John Odell is Curator of History and Research at the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum, and he has been loving the best job in the world since he arrived at Cooperstown in 1999. A frequent contributor to many Hall of Fame publications, he has served as lead curator for numerous permanent exhibitions at the Hall, including Diamond Dreams, Women in Baseball, Viva Baseball, Whole New Ball Game, and the museum's most recent permanent edition, Shoebox Treasures, which explores the world of collecting baseball cards. He also serves on the Hall's 2 accessions committees. Prior to moving to Cooperstown, John served for 11 years in the US Senate Curator's Office in Washington, DC, and for 3 years as a National Park Service Ranger at Independence National Historic Park in Philadelphia and Yorktown Battlefield in Virginia. He has his master's degree in museum studies from George Washington University and his bachelor's degree from Davidson College. Welcome to our panel, John. And finally, Ted. Ted Knorr is a longtime SABR member with a strong interest in the Negro Leagues. He is the founder of SABR's oldest topical conference, the Jerry Malloy Negro League Conference. He was instrumental in starting annual Negro League celebrations in conjunction with the Harrisburg Senators, Lancaster Barnstormers, and York Revolution. He is a big booster of Negro League outfielder Rap Dixon, and in 2007, he raised funds to erect a baseball marker on Dixon's grave in historic Midland Cemetery, Steelton, Pennsylvania. Welcome, Ted. And actually, Ted deserves extra credit because this panel was really his idea. So thank you for Ted for having this panel idea and also for inviting the panelists we have with us today. So my first question is for Phil. So Phil, the question is, you wrote a biography about the great Rube Foster. Could you tell us something about this man and his importance to baseball history, what you learned by writing about him and researching his life, and also about how he founded the Negro National League in 1920, the first ever national league for Black baseball players?
Yes, the name Rube Foster is probably familiar to most people who have followed in some aspect the Negro baseball leagues. I think one of the reasons I wanted to write a book about Rube is because I feel like the early years and the way that Rube thought and how he executed those beliefs were never really told. So, and even as a great player in those early years, it was also not discussed. So I go back and talk about his days in Texas, where he was with the Waco Yellow Jackets, an outstanding team, and then how he first comes to Chicago. And then actually he plays just for a brief period with a white team in Michigan. But then, of course, he jumps across to the East with the Cuban X-Giants. And of course, the Philadelphia Giants in 1905, who I happen to think was the equal to any Major League Baseball team during that period, the 1905 Philadelphia Giants. And Rube Foster was their leading pitcher. As a matter of fact, they had 3 30-game winners. And Saul White, who's also in the Hall of Fame now, was their manager. So I just felt that the early years of Rube Foster wasn't told. What's told more, and what they begin to talk about Rube, is him as an administrator. And of course, when they elected him to the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1980, he was put in as an administrator, not as a ball player. So I think it's really important to show how this man was shaped and why he felt like a Negro League was important. I also might mention that in my estimation, he had two of the great, he played on actually the 1905 Philadelphia Giants, who I think was an outstanding team. And then of course he had another really good team, the 1910 Chicago Leland Giants. And that was the last year of the Leland Giants under his leadership before he organized the American Giants. So he was an organizer. And one thing I might mention about the American Giants is simply this. When he organized the American Giants, everybody around the country, when they did not put Negro baseball players' pictures in the newspapers, the word Giants was an identifying factor. So you had many African-American teams that went by the name Giants. But when Foster, when he started his new team, he wanted to make them represent all of America and be heads and tails above all the other Giants. So his team became the American Giants. And actually for many years, it was the American Giants from Chicago. It wasn't the Chicago American Giants. And so Rube Foster was a visionary. And of course, when they organized the Negro National League and they pulled together all of these great independent owners of teams. And of course, Rube Foster at that particular time was a booking agent operating the Detroit Stars, the Cuban team, and his own team, the Chicago American Giants. He sacrificed all of that as a booking agent to come in and make his teams a part of the first Negro National League. And it was very successful in 1920, and that's why we're still talking about it today.
That was a lovely answer. And actually, you've picked up on a theme that I've heard running now through all 3 panels of today, which is sort of what's one of the things that inspires a SABR researcher or wants to make you do research. And you said it yourself. You thought there was a story that hadn't been told and you wanted to tell it. I think that's fantastic. And I really like how you pointed out the complexity of the man. And we don't often gather to celebrate administrators. So isn't that cool that you've got like a master administrator is part of your answer? I love that. So now I know I was going to ask you about the Chicago American Giants, but I should now say the American Giants of Chicago. So you've already taught me something. Thank you. Mm-hmm. So the American Giants of 1921 were a terrific baseball team. Tell us something about their 1921 season and what made them so great. And that's again a question for Phil.
Okay, well, first of all, this is a really special team. They had been together, different players, for a number of years. And so this team is built around Rube's specialty. So he went out and found players that fit right into his thinking and how to manage a team. So for instance, you're going to have people like Bingo DeMoss, who was a great bunter, also one of the fastest men in baseball. The same thing with Dave Malosher, one of the fastest men in baseball. And let's see, Jimmy Lyons, who was also considered one of the fastest men in baseball as well. So you got a team built on speed that is second to no team probably in this country. And so Rube Foster was patterning that because they did a lot of bunting, and he played in the big park, which was the old Chicago White Sox park. So they didn't hit a lot of balls out of that park. So he didn't build his team on power, even though he had Cristobal Torrente, but he built his team on speed and defense. So Dave Malosher at that particular time was considered one of the greatest third basemen, not only in the Negro League, in the world. And so, and then he had great pitching too. But he had a couple of really good lefties, and Dave Brown was one of them. And so he had a team that was well-rounded, a very good team. able to compete with any team in the Negro National League. And of course, they pretty much rolled to the pennant. And of course, they didn't have a World Series there, but he did take his team east at the end of the year. So yeah, really good team. And I think a team that probably deserves more conversation than it's been getting.
Great, thank you for that. And I really liked what you said about designing the team for the ballpark. That's an interesting consideration as well, because they were playing in a big space. So thank you, fascinating. And there is, for those who are interested, the 1921 project has a fantastic section on the Negro National League ballparks of 1921, which I think is a really wonderful part of the project, because often that's something they had to scramble to get, right? It wasn't something that was a given. So anyway, thank you for those answers. Now we're going to move on to John. And just a reminder, if you're listening to this panel, if you do have questions, just throw them into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you can ask that. We will have time for questions at the end of this panel. So my first question for John: you have told me that the Baseball Hall of Fame has some very interesting artifacts from the 1921 season. Could you tell me something about some of those items?
Yes, absolutely. I'm happy to do that. But what I'd like to do, because I'm kind of a visual guy and the Hall of Fame is renowned for being able to see the real thing, I've pulled together some images and I'm going to share my screen here to allow folks to see what I'm talking about. As soon as I can, there we go. That's what I'm looking at right there. Let's see. I'm now screen sharing. Is that what you're seeing? Are you seeing my Babe Ruth's crown and Babe Ruth?
Absolutely, we can see that. You might want to move it into slide view though, because we can also see the individual slides on the side. Yeah.
Okay, hold on for a moment. I've got.
It looks like you might have to hit enable editing, because it's asking you if you can, and in order to move to slide view.
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
No, I am having some difficulty with this. Have not had that before.
Usually if you just hit the enable editing button that is at the very top, in that yellow banner at the top of your screen, it'll allow you to work with the file. But you need to hit on it because you're the one with the power.
Right. The
it's right below where you see file, home, insert, design, etc. There should be a yellow banner that says enable editing. Just hit the enable editing where it says that.
Yeah, I'm not seeing that.
Oh, you're not seeing that? Okay.
No.
That's what I'm seeing on my screen. Well, I don't
I
know.
don't think he's in slideshow mode.
I had tried to be in slideshow mode. Let's try again.
Yeah.
Let me.
Jacob also says he can share the slides if you'd prefer.
I would prefer that. Jacob, can you jump in?
Come to the rescue, Jacob. There you go. There we go. This is lovely.
Great.
So then you'll just have to tell him when you want him to
I can do that.
advance. Yeah, you just tell him orally. And
Play from the start. Okay, so
absolutely.
Very good. So the first, the most amazing thing, of course, one of the most amazing things about the 21 season was Babe Ruth's 59 home runs, which dwarfs anybody else that year. He received this crown, which we see on the left, from the fans. A group of fans got together, and if you contributed $6 to this program, you could get a signed baseball from Babe Ruth. That was the bonus for contributing to this silver crown. It was obviously a very beautiful piece. It's on exhibit at the Baseball Hall of Fame, and very often you'll see there's a standard picture of Babe Ruth, in his Yankees uniform wearing this crown, but I liked this one. He's got a birthday cake there in front of him. Next slide, please. Of course, the Yankees ended up winning the American League pennant, but losing the World Series to the New York Giants. On the left is the trophy that the ball players on the Giants went in on to purchase for John McGraw, their manager, for what they saw as his great work in creating the this team that ended up winning the World Series. On the right is the watch fob, the pocket watch fob, which was the World Series champions award for winning the World Series. The thing that's especially interesting about this is not only was it designed by Tiffany, but it was the first time, this was the first award given under the Kennesaw Mountain Landis regime. And previously, the National Commission, which preceded him, had only issued a silver button, or sorry, a gold button, which is a lapel button, it fit on your lapel. And it looked the same from year to year to year. There was very, very little difference. At this point, 1921, every team would now get a chance to design its own award, its own jewelry. In the 1920s, it was watch fobs and wrist watches and pocket watches. By the 1930s, it was always rings. And so this is a wonderful transition decade. But this was the very first of the team designed decorations. Next, please. We also received back in the 1980s or 1980 when Rube Foster was inducted. Rube Foster's son created the Rube Foster scrapbook and donated it to the National Baseball Hall of Fame. And you can see here a couple of pages out of that scrapbook. So that the opportunity then to sort of set the scene of 1921 from the artifact point of view is something that the Hall of Fame is able to do. And next slide, please. I'd like to move on to the tabletop games now and focus on the dice related games. I recently did a small exhibit about fantasy baseball at the Hall of Fame, which of course has its roots in tabletop baseball. All games, all of these tabletop type games need some kind of a randomizer. The one on the left is a beautifully designed spinner, which has concentric rings depending on how many ball players are on base and how many outs are there. And it's really amazingly ornate and pretty detailed. But otherwise, and very often it was simply cards. You just reshuffled the deck and laid out the cards, whether it was a strike or a hit, and then what kind of a hit, whether it was an out, that kind of thing. Next slide, please. Dice quickly became an important randomizer. In 1885, our national ball game came out. And you can see on the right-hand side, the umpire, as it was called, so that when you rolled the two dice, it would tell you what was going to happen, what happened on that. What is consistent with this, and then for the next 45 years, is that everybody is treated the same. There's no difference among the different players statistically. Next slide, please. In 1930-31, the National Pastime Game came out, invented by Clifford Van Beek, who used the previous year's stats to create individualized cards for each ball player. And you can see that rather than, for instance, 12 and 21 are two different things. Instead of just a two die and a one die means one thing and the other die means the other. And so you have a lot more opportunities to have different kinds of plays. It only lasted 1 year. That was it. The National Pastime, the baseball game that's different, had cards for players from the leading players, 16 players from each league. So each team on each league. So this was it was a big deal that he was able to create. Next slide, please. Oh, by the way, you saw that was Ethan Allen was the card that I chose to show. And the reason I did that was because Ethan Allen then invented his own all-star baseball game in 1941. the All-Star Baseball game, Ethan Allen's All-Star Baseball game, had its own unusual style, which was a dial that you placed over your at-bat and then spun it. This is an earlier iteration. It's not the first year, but it's one of the earlier ones. And this was Allen's attempt at creating a game that was weighted towards the abilities of a ball player. So here Melot is chosen. He has without being able to read the key, you can't tell that he actually is quite a slugger. Next slide, please. ATBA, invented, I'll put that in quotation marks, by Richard Seitz back in the 1930s. He's talked a lot about how he created a game that he and his schoolmates played. The one thing that he did do was create pitcher data. So you can see here Satchel Paige, whom I chose because this is the 50th anniversary of Paige's induction into the Hall of Fame. So we've got the stats here, or his vital statistics are here, and then roll the dice from 1-1 through 6-6, and you get a chance to see what Satchel Paige would do as a hitter. Next slide, please. Here are the two cards, the National Pastime card versus the ATBA card, and I think that you can decide on your own whether Richard Seitz was very influenced by Clifford Van Beek's invention of the National Pastime game. I think it's pretty clear that there's something going on when you even look at some of the numbers are exactly the same. The results, many of the results are the same for the numbers that are coming out. So this is the element that people look to and go, well, who knows exactly who invented what, but I will leave it to you to, I think that it's pretty clear that Clifford Van Beek's inspiration, at the very least, continues all the way to today. Next page, please. Then in 1961, some other guy created some other baseball game, which we don't need to get into. It has some differences to ATBA, and certainly is quite popular. Next page, please. As are all sorts of other games. This is the result really coming out of everybody loves baseball. The idea of wanting to find exactly the right way to play baseball. What do you highlight? What do you not highlight? And trying to find that balance of ease of entry, excitement, ability to play it, ability to teach it, and today this kind of game is still, as you all know, many people know, still played by many folks. And this is the kind of game that ended up leading eventually into the fantasy baseball that we're aware of today, which was, rather than taking historical numbers and applying them to the board game, you take numbers that are created in real time, and you just have to wait for it to play out. But the difference is that today's fantasy baseball, the rotisserie type, is sort of forward looking into anticipating what's going to happen. Obviously, the previous games allow you to play as fast as you can roll a die. You can play a game, and so you're not constrained by time in quite the same way. Next page. I think that's it. So that's, in a nutshell, the artifacts that we have here at the Baseball Hall of Fame, and a brief overview of some highlight artifacts from 1921, as well as some of the items that we have are related to tabletop baseball.
Thank you very much for that walk through history through visuals. All of those were very much appreciated. Now, you really gave us a visual history of baseball simulation. Is there anything that you wanted to add to that before we move into, I see Ted's already ready, the actual simulation.
No, as a matter of fact, I wanted to make sure I wrapped up quickly enough so that Ted could actually hop to it and carry us on to the next level.
Well, there you go. All right, then we're ready. Thank you for that history lesson on baseball simulation and how it has taken place up to the present. So Ted, now, the racism of the time meant that the 1921 World Series winning New York Giants and the Negro National League champion Chicago American Giants never played a championship match against one another. But what if they had? And here you are. Here's Ted Knorr to tell us what could have happened based on a baseball simulation he ran for this imaginary championship series.
Okay, thank you. And I hope I don't need Jacob. Let's see if I think I'm okay. Okay, I'm gonna, like John, I hope to move through this pretty fast in order to give time for questions for both Phil and John. But in 1921, according to my story, the New York Giants and the Chicago American Giants were matched up in a baseball championship series after the two of them took care of opponents within their leagues. In the case of the American Giants, two other very good black teams on the East Coast. The series itself sets up because of a relationship between these two young men. On the right is Rube Foster. We've already covered him. He was the administrator, but also a spectacular player before he founded the Negro National League. On the left is Cap Anson. He, of course, is given the blame for much of the color ban that occurred in baseball 40 years prior. And nothing I say today absolves him, except to say that the two of them did compete in the Chicago City Leagues in the the aughts and the early teens. And in my imagination, Anson gets to Landis, and Landis sees an opportunity, especially in light of the first two panels, the bad news that baseball was in. And John Fredland's wonderful game story, which I don't know if it's up yet, but it will be soon, gives you a little more detail as to how this possibly could have happened. Okay. In Atlantic City, which was the Vegas of the time, there was no Las Vegas, Atlantic City looked at these two teams and they picked the New York Giants as a 6.5 to 5 favorite over the Chicago American Giants. Now, what could lead someone to that conclusion? APA has a computer alternative way to play the game. It's not the way I used for the series, but I did run a 1,600 game set of games between New York and Chicago just to see what the APA game might really be saying. And you can see, in the opinion of APA, 27 years ago, the Chicago American Giants are the product of Jim Riley's statistics in 1994. But at that time, it looks like they felt that the New York Giants would win about 56% of the time against the Chicago American Giants. I'm not so sure if Phil agrees. I'm not sure if I agree. Phil and I both have, by the way, Chicago paraphernalia on. But that's the situation we're in. And if two teams had this relationship, the New York Giants would win 64% of the time in a 9-game series. I asked SABR members to offer who they felt would win, and unfortunately, I only had 5 takers. 3 of them picked the New York Giants, and 2 of them picked the Chicago American Giants. And John Herson, the president of the APA Game Company, has awarded a Negro League baseball card set to one of those 5 people who picked this series correctly. Okay, another way to get a look at the favorites, and this illustrates the bias that still exists in baseball, and I'm talking about the Hall of Fame. If you look at the New York Giants, you see those 4 asterisks in the top 5 spots in the batting order. They have 4 Hall of Famers plus their manager. The Chicago American Giants, on the other hand, have 1, Cristobal Torriente and Rube Foster, their manager. Now, I've put pound signs next to 3 that I think have a strong case for the Hall. That'd be Jimmy Lyons, Bingo DeMoss, and Dave Malarcher. All 3 of them, in my opinion, have a strong Hall of Fame case. Okay, now we're into it. Best of 9, we're opening up on Wednesday, October 19th. I think the day before, Chicago was playing Hilldale, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, the New York series in the Polo Grounds finished about a week earlier with the New York Giants defeating the New York Yankees in 8 games. Here, this game, 25,000 fans are in the stands. It's a nice day. And the big left-hander, Dave Brown, he's 5'10", but that was big for that time. He's rolling right along into the 8th inning with a 5-2 lead. And Rube Foster certainly didn't expect that not to hold up. John McGraw, though, shows his hand in the top of the 8th when he puts Jess Barnes, who was one of the heroes of the World Series, into the game to keep Chicago right where they're at. Barnes does just that, but in the bottom of the 8th, Brown runs out of gas. And the New York Giants cracked 6 consecutive hits and have a 6-5 lead into the top of the 9th. And Barnes is up to his task, and the New York Giants get the first serve. The second game is interesting because the exact opposite thing happens. Art Neff, who was the big winner for New York that year, a 20-game winner, and a left-hander, he's rolling along with a 5-4 lead into the 9th inning. And by now, Foster, he's put Dave Brown into the game, holding the Giants at bay in the 8th and 9th. And sure enough, let me describe it accurately. DeMoss leads off with a walk. After a Lions strikeout, Torriente triples, and then Jim Brown knocks Torriente in. And Dave Brown this time is up to the task, and the series is all even. After 2 games, both teams have scored the same amount of runs, so we're not giving away our hand quite yet. It's on to Chicago. The New York Giants travel on the 20th Century Limited, and the Chicago American Giants, which wasn't their usual mode of transportation, are on the Broadway Limited. Game 3. Interesting game. Fred, Tony, now we're into the 3rd pitchers for each team. The rotation of New York is the same they used against the Yankees. The Chicago rotation is the 3 most popular pitchers that they used that year. But this game, it was a pitcher's game. However, Fred Tony wins it at bat. The first New York run is Tony's 3rd inning homer, and the 3 runs in the 5th are Tony's 3-run homer. So he both pitched and hit the New York Giants to the 2-1 lead. Game 4, we heard about this pitcher in the previous mark. He left baseball a couple years later with a bad mark against him. But on this day, Phil Douglas had a marvelous game, one of the best, maybe the best game in postseason history up to that time. He only faced 30 batters, gives up only 1 hit. Jimmy Lyons beat an infield grounder out. And the New York Giants have claimed a good lead at this point, 3-1. Final game in Chicago before we go back to New York. Art Neff, once again, is given the ball for the Giants, and he won the clinching game against the Yankees in the World Series. Unfortunately for him, he didn't quite have it in this game. Tom Williams pitches well enough, and this game ends on a marvelous play by Malarcher. With 2 men on, there was a ground ball down the line, and he had to go to first. It was too deep for him to run to third, and he got the runner to end the game. So this was an extremely close game. Back to New York, 3-2, the Giants have the edge, and now it's game 6. All right. Once again, it's pitcher Fred Tony. Once again, it's his bat. He certainly doesn't pitch a sterling game, yielding 7 runs. But his team and his bat, he goes 2 for 4. He doesn't leave the ballpark, but he's now 4 for 8. And the Giants now have a vice grip on the game with a 4-2 lead. Game 7 in the Polo Grounds, Dave Brown shows his true stuff. So far, he's had a couple of mediocre games. He ran out of gas in that opening game. He did win the second, and now he throws a 4-hitter. He's untouchable. And the American Giants do much better against Phil Douglas his second time out. Okay, back to Chicago. The Giants again on the 20th Century Lemon and the American Giants on the Broadway. I leave this blank, and you can guess why. It's 4-3. And the New York Giants hold serve this time. Art Neff, interestingly, he was 0-2 here, and he wins this game. Identical what he did in the World Series. He was 0-2 there before winning the clinching game. So there you have it. It was 8 games. Despite my outfit and Phil's hat, we couldn't pull it off. I'll leave it up to others to see if this was what most people would think. I do want to congratulate Sandra Marario of New York City, who picked the New York Giants in 8 games. So she's going to win a set of APA cards, which are marvelous. And I hope she likes them, because I'm not sure she's ever played APA. And I do want to thank these people before I turn it back over. Bill Nolan and Sharon Hamilton for their faith in this project, the SABR Century Committee and the Games and Simulation Committee for the same thing, John Odell and Phil Dixon for their marvelous presentations. And I hope we're not done with them yet, because the Q&A I think should be pretty good. John Fredland wrote a wonderful game story about this series. David Avens helped me with some statistical assistance. John Herson, the president of the APA Game Company, of course, has given me that prize for Sandra. John Asselon provided some late publicity within the APA world, and Martha Levis for introducing me to the game of APA back in 1962. It's all yours, Sharon.
Thank you, Ted. That was certainly a fascinating presentation about a championship series that never took place. I actually have a question for you, because I think that there may be people who are tuned into this who might not be that familiar with the history of baseball simulation and how baseball, I mean, we've seen the board games and cards and things, but I think it would interest people to know, how did you actually do the simulation that you just showed us?
Okay, well, again, 1,620 games I played on the computer, but these 8, I literally rolled the dice. In fact, I should have showed you a card when the New York Giants had 8 straight men reach the plate. This is what the card looks like, although John Odell did cover that. This is Beauty Bancroft, who led off that inning with a base hit. So the cards, as John showed him, they're dice activated. You roll the dice, there's 36 possibilities, and simply put, a 333 hitter will have 12 hit possibilities out of those 36. It's a little more complicated than that, but I think that should suffice.
So what happens with, I know when you said you ran it on a computer first, and that was the part I was trying to understand. What part does the computer play? Like, why is there a computer involved? Why don't you just, from beginning to end, you could do this with cards and dice, right?
You could. It takes about 25 minutes to play a game with the cards, and both managers are me. Steve Steinberg said earlier about McGraw's bunting philosophy, and I looked it up, and of course he's exactly right. One of the key runs in that Raleigh was a bunt. I had McGraw bunt, but he is the 6th of 8 in the National League that year most frequent bunter, so he might not have bunted. Rube Foster's the opposite. And so when I'm controlling both teams, as I am with the dice, I'm making decisions for both teams. On the computer, the managers, I had Foster and McGraw made by another computer designer up in New York State, whom I forgot to thank. And
I
the computer,
see. So
the computer plays 1,600 games in 15 minutes.
the
That's
computer's
another-
faster. And do you
Much
the short, simple answer is the computer's faster. But I think you said for this series, because it was so tight, you know, you were showing us that the series was going back and forth. These were very talented teams playing one another, and they were really very closely matched. Was one of the things that you were also interested in using a computer for was to see if you really were coming out with the most probable outcome if these, or is that not a consideration? Is a probability?
It was a consideration, and I think it shows more the opinion of the APA Game Company and Jim Riley's statistics 27 years ago. I personally, I don't think the New York Giants would win 56% of the time against the Chicago American Giants. I think they'd be pretty evenly matched.
Right. And that was certainly my takeaway from seeing your slides, that these were pretty evenly matched teams in terms of talent. And of course,
no doubt.
One of the things that you kind of pointed out, though, in your slides, which is a consideration when we're looking at the history of the Negro Leagues, is that even where there is obvious equality in terms of level of talent, there was not obvious equality in terms of playing conditions. And players who were with the Negro Leagues were often, like you said, they were on not such a nice form of transportation. And so that also could affect if players are showing up at a game, they're more tired, and you know, maybe they had to sleep in whatever their form of transportation was because they're not able to get into segregated hotels. Is that something you want to talk about as well, as someone who is a historian and also playing a game? Is that something that you also consider in a championship series between these people?
I want to defer to Phil there, but I do want to make one other obvious comment. The New York Giants in the computer, I played them as if it was World Series. So they both had limited rosters, but the roster size of the New York team throughout a full season, if I hadn't have limited them, would have been another advantage they have. But Phil can elaborate on these social issues.
Thank you. That would be great, Phil. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, the conditions under which Negro National League teams were playing in 1920 and 1921?
Yeah, well, one thing about it, the travel conditions, they were still using the trains at that time. And if you know anything about Rube Foster traveled his team first class. So they're going to have the best travel conditions. Now, it's going to be segregated trains, but it's going to be on a train. And so they're not going to be as put to the test as much they would have been like if they were traveling by bus as they were later. So in this particular case, I'm going to say in a series like that, it's going to be pretty closely matched on the travel. So I don't think that it gives one team an advantage on the travel. And but you know, they were making a long trip back to Chicago too. So I think that the travel is not that much of a problem. Now, one other thing, because they're playing in major cities, they wouldn't have a problem with hotel accommodations either. But of course, the New York Giants, if they came to Chicago, they could stay downtown. Of course, the American Giants are going to be staying on the south side of Chicago, but there were some darn good African-American hotels on the south side. So they're not going to have much of a disadvantage either. So overall, I think that it was a series at that time where they could literally play ball.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you for that answer. And actually, Phil, I didn't know about that. That's great to hear that they would have had actually very good transportation and access to good hotels. So not a factor in our historical matchup, or not a significant factor, would have been those type of social considerations. So we have some questions that have come in the Q&A. So one of the questions for our panelists is, Given the increased ability for research over the last 27 years, has there been an update on the Jim Riley stats that shaped the APA cards in particular and overall records in general?
Well, I'd like to take a crack at that. The Jim Riley stats, no, although there is someone looking at updating his biographical encyclopedia. But the seam head stats that are online are the ones that, for better or for worse, Major League Baseball and Elias Sports Bureau are looking at using, and I think that's fine and it'll work out well. I'd like to hear Phil and John on that also.
Sure, would you guys like to weigh in?
Yeah, I'll be happy to, but I also want Scott Bush to step in on this. I think that the Hall of Fame back in 2001, 2002 initiated a very broad research, which ended up resulting in a number of Negro Leaguers, 16, 17 Negro Leaguers being inducted into the Hall all at once, the recognition being that those numbers were not going to change. That is, the original numbers were not going to change, but we hoped that, and it has proven to be the case, that by beginning the process of collating statistics, that it would kick off the a greater understanding, appreciation, and opportunity to collect more statistics again. And I know that that has happened over the past almost 20 years, and I think that to the extent that the Hall of Fame has done anything good in this manner, the creation of that group that formulated the basis for the beginning of a review of the treatment of Black ball players. I think that's one of the greatest things that's happened.
Thank you, John. Phil, did you want to add anything before, if Scott wants to answer as well? We did have an indication that he might want to, but Phil, is there anything else you would like to say?
Yeah, we're always finding more statistics. That's one thing for sure. And in this particular case, I'm sure that the 30 years ago, and from what I've seen, and actually I was around 30 years ago, there's been a lot more information found, and actually new ways to look at it as well. So
right.
It's a good point. Perspective matters as well. Scott, did you want to say something? No.
I actually was just helping remove the question from the queue.
I
had nothing to add. Sorry for getting in the way.
Purely administrative function. Ted, what were you going to say?
I just want to add to what John said, and this may be a surprise to him, but the seam heads number are 30% more statistics than what the NL RAG did under the Hall of Fame's auspices in '06. So it's important for the Hall to realize already there's more data and more Hall of Fame candidates that need to be looked at.
That's fantastic. Thank you for making that important point. So we have another question now. Because of the random nature of dice outcomes, etc., what does Ted think would happen if he repeated his card simulation 10 times or 20 times or whatever?
Well, my personal guess would be, based on what the computer shows me, that the New York Giants would win 6 or 7 times. I don't think that's what it should be, but that's what the APA game would show.
Yeah, we're really constrained by the, in the case of the game, constrained by the numbers that are fed into it. And so
right.
It's like, so you can run it as many times. Now, if we were able to use today's numbers, Ted, I think that would be, that would be a very different thing. And to run it then again in 10 or 20 years, could be something else entirely. It's just wonderful, the number of the amount of data that is coming out. And I think that with this past year, the Major League Baseball finally acknowledging that these Black leagues were major leagues, I think is going to help a lot of baseball fans appreciate those leagues even more. And I think it raises the actions of these men. I think of certainly of Buck O'Neill, who spoke so highly always of the men that he managed and played with and played against. I think it's going a long way to proving his statements about the quality of the play in black baseball.
That's fantastic. Thank you. We have another question, a serious question comment. Has anyone looked into additional card game series between other great teams, including those apart in time? I once started plotting a fiction piece in which the 1998 Yankees play the 1927 Yankees in a 7-game series based on a card game I have, but found that even though I know history and baseball, I couldn't get deep enough into the heads of these characters to write it properly. But has anyone ever thought about having, say, the 1986 Mets play the 1929 A's?
I'd like to comment on that one.
Sure, go ahead, Phil.
Baseball, is unique in that, if you were to take a football team from the 1990s and then say we're going to play a football team from the 1927 season, nobody would even think that it would be even close. And but I happen to think there's quite a few similarities in baseball because the game has changed so much. I was a coach, and I can tell you what I've seen in just 30 years of changing the way we taught players to bunt and those kind of things. The whole hitting strategy has changed. You had guys. You look at old film; they got hitches in their swings from the 20s, and and they're winding up their bat and all this kind. Nobody would teach that today. So, and then the other thing was a lot of those ball players back then, they didn't stay in shape year round. They'd had to go and get another job after the season ended, and it might be a labor-intensive job, or they could have been sitting in an office or in a car dealership. Whereas these ball players today, they can work out year round, and the equipment they use to work out is far better. So I would think that any team today would have an advantage over a team from yesterday, whether it be basketball, baseball, or football.
Thank you for that answer, Phil. Ted wanted to chime in, I think.
Well, I just wanted to answer the question from my perspective. Every APBA player that ever lived has done exactly what the questioner wanted to know. We always play teams, but I agree with Phil. In a real situation, a modern baseball team would defeat most of the older teams.
Yeah, the one thing that I would like to see would be the 98 Yankees use the 1927 Yankees equipment in the game, and it would be a nice equalizer there to be swinging 40-ounce bats and playing with gloves that are no bigger than their hands, that they have to use 2 hands on, and that have no webs. So I think we wouldn't see quite so many over the and let's use the old ball as well.
So can we have something thrown into the game that will allow for that variation? Some sort of card you pick up to you lose points because you realize the bat's too heavy or whatever. Sounds like someone needs to work on this.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, that is all of the questions that we had in the Q&A. So you guys have done a fantastic a job of answering all the questions that people had. Are there final thoughts on this fictional simulated series that you would like to share with folks before we end this panel?
Yes, I would like to just say one thing, and that is I look forward to the Games and Simulation Committee to become a little more active. Frankly, I really wasn't too aware of it, but I think things just like this program would be a good thing moving forward.
Well, thank you, Ted. Those are lovely thoughts. And I really think one of the things that you certainly did for me in bringing forward this panel idea was to show the wonderful role that imagination can play in baseball history, because here we have a series that didn't actually take place. And not only have you presented a whole hour panel on this series that never took place, we have a games project committee project that's just gone up with a write-up of this entire series that never took place. And how wonderful is that? And based on statistical evidence that you guys have looked at. So this is actually very exciting to show what the combination of facts from the real world and historical research can and your imagination can bring us something that the world didn't actually have a chance to have in real life. Phil or John, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I would like to add something. I'm going to speak in behalf of Ruth Foster, and I'm going to say that we're going to dispute this series because we didn't get a chance to use any African-American umpires. And so anyway, no, it's been fun.
Well, Phil, that's quite right. And actually, Bill Noel wrote a great piece that's actually on the 1921 website now about 1921 umpires. And I believe that exact point is in there. So I think that's a great point that you've just raised. Not fair. We're going to have to address that. Maybe you could go back and Ted could do some more throws considering the unfair umpire situation. And John, did you have some final thoughts too?
No, I really didn't. Oh, well, that's not true. I always have more thoughts. But I was thrilled to be a part of this. Thank you very much, Ted, for inviting and for inviting me to be a part of this, to get a chance to look in. And the thing that I liked most was when I looked into our collections, and I did not realize that we had Rube Foster's scrapbook, the one that his son created using the Chicago Defender clippings. It's not a contemporary scrapbook, but you know something? I'll bet somebody's got one of those out there somewhere. And as we move forward, we may get fortunate enough to find something like that, and that would be a terrific thing. But the opportunity to go through and find, three really neat things that were so closely tied, inextricably tied to 1921, from the Yankees, from the Giants, from the Chicago American Giants. It was just great fun for me. So thanks very much.
Oh, well, your objects were wonderful, and thank you for sharing them with us. I have to admit, I was really blown away by the Tiffany watch fob. That was where we said the watch, like, I would not have expected that was the thing that you would pick as a World Series winners.
Well, yeah, the great thing about this this panel that we had is that it helps me show off the fact that really the Baseball Hall of Fame is about the intersection of baseball and people. And whether it's the players, the fans, and today. So it's not just bats and balls and gloves. And that's one of the beauties. That's one of the joys that I have in going in every day.
Thank you very much. And of course, all three of you, and thank you so much for being with us today, have brought history to life in such an exciting way by rewriting it, which I think is fantastic. I really liked participating in this championship series that never took place. I don't know whether, Jacob, did you want to come on and say final words for our wrapping up today? Or Scott, it's the end of the Century Committee panels for today.
Yeah, I've got you.
Jacob
Sharon.
is there. There you go. You've been our masters of ceremonies. I thought maybe you would want to say the final words. We've done 3 hours of great panels on baseball in 1921.
Well, thank you, Sharon, for another terrific discussion, and thanks to Ted and John and Phil as well for sharing their insight, because this is a great conversation. It's incredible to have this type of imagination on baseball history and to bring it to life the way that Ted, John, and Phil have today. So thank you again, Sharon, for 2 terrific panels moderating these discussions. And thanks to everybody for the past 3 months for the Summer of SABR Golden Celebration Series. We've had so many terrific panels and presentations since June. We've talked about the future of women in baseball, the Negro Leagues as major leagues, baseball in Latin America. We've had a preview of Team USA's run to a silver medal at the Tokyo Olympics. We had the entire Jerry Molloy Negro League Conference online in July. And then this week, we've looked back at SABR's 50th anniversary, and we've had a look at baseball labor relations, and today the 100-year centennial anniversary of the 1921 baseball season. All of the video recordings from the Summer of SABR will be available online beginning next week at sabr.org/summer for anyone who wants to watch again or for the first time. Otherwise, on behalf of Scott Bush and Scott Carter at the SABR office, thanks again to all of our hosts, our panelists, our presenters for an outstanding Summer of SABR Golden Celebration series this year. It's been an amazing first 50 years for SABR since 1971, and we look forward to having all of you as part of our baseball community for the next 50 years and see what's to come. So thank you again, and signing off.